history lies, not with silence, but with omissions sharp enough to cut. Whole kingdoms erased, their names swallowed by dust, their monuments strangled by jungle, their stones left to whisper in ruins. Khmer, Mali, Great Zimbabwe, civilizations that bent rivers, commanded oceans of gold, raised temples that clawed the sky, and then vanished, as if the earth itself conspired to bury their memory. A jungle swallowing Angkor's colossal towers, its roots cracking stone like bones. Caravans of gold crossing the Sahara, their glow so blinding that kings trembled at the name of Mali. Walls of granite rising in the heart of Africa, fit together without mortar, standing as if forged by gods rather than men. These are not fables. These are not shadows. They lived, they reigned, they fell, and yet the world pretends they were never there. Why? Who profits when empires are forgotten? The maps burned, the chronicles twisted, archaeologists arriving centuries late, finding only ruins and silence. What remains is a riddle wrapped in smoke, a story torn from the page, clawing its way back through legend and stone. Step closer. Listen. The forgotten empires breathe still, and their silence is more dangerous than their power ever was. The Mekong River begins high in the Tibetan Plateau, cutting its way through China before flowing southward into mainland Southeast Asia, shaping lands that would one day carry the weight of empires. By the time it enters Cambodia, it is no longer a wild mountain torrent but a broad artery, rich with silt, bending and shifting with the seasons, flooding and receding, dictating life and death for those who lived along its banks. This river and the plains it nourished formed the foundation upon which the Khmer civilization emerged, a landscape both merciless and generous, one that demanded mastery but rewarded it with abundance. The region of mainland Southeast Asia was defined not only by rivers but by monsoons. Rain came in torrents from May to October, swelling rivers, saturating rice fields, and leaving behind layers of fertile soil. Then came the dry season, stretching from November to April, when the Mekong contracted, its waters receding, leaving pools and channels filled with fish. In Cambodia, at the heart of the Khmer world, this rhythm was intensified by the Tunnel Sap, a lake whose flow reversed every year, expanding nearly 6 times in size during the rainy season before shrinking back during the dry months. The Tunnel Sap was not just a body of water, it was the pulse of Khmer life. Its annual flood brought millions of fish and created fertile floodplains, a food source so abundant that it allowed population growth on a scale few regions could sustain. It was here, in this basin of water and silt, that Angkor would rise. The geography dictated the possibilities. Endless flat plains to the north and south of the Tunnel Sap, fringed by forests, with the Dangrek Mountains marking the northern boundary and the Cardamom Mountains lying far to the southwest. This setting created both isolation and opportunity. The Khmer heartland was shielded by natural barriers, yet connected through rivers that stretched like veins to China, India, and the Indian Ocean trade routes. Geography gave the Khmers both security and access. The earliest organized states in this region, Funan and Chenla, emerged centuries before Angkor, between the 1st and 7th centuries CE, laying foundations of culture, politics, and economy that would influence the Khmer. Funan flourished in the Mekong Delta, benefiting from maritime trade linking India and China, while Chenla rose farther north, nearer to the Mekong's interior. By the time Jayavarman II, in 802 CE, declared himself Chakravartin, a universal monarch, on Phnom Killin, the geography of the Mekong heartland had already proven it could sustain centralized states. What changed under the Khmers was the sheer scale of their ambition, and geography was their instrument. The Angkorian kings understood the river and the rains not as obstacles but as forces to be harnessed. They transformed the landscape into an engineered environment, constructing massive reservoirs, barrays, each stretching for kilometers, and canals that redirected monsoon waters. The East Baray, completed in the 10th century, measured nearly 7 kilometers long and 1.8 kilometers wide. Later, the West Baray surpassed it, spanning over 8 kilometers by 2 kilometers. These were not merely storage tanks. They were symbols of control over nature, demonstrations that the king could command the waters themselves. The hydraulic system turned unpredictable monsoons into reliable agriculture, allowing 3 rice harvests a year in some areas, feeding populations estimated between 750,000 and 1 million at Angkor's height, a metropolis unmatched anywhere else in the medieval world. The geography also dictated political and military realities. To the west lay the Chao Phraya Basin, future home of Thai states like Sukhothai and Ayutthaya, which would become rivals. To the east stretched the Annamite Cordillera, beyond which were the Vietnamese states expanding southward. The Khmers were at once shielded and threatened by these neighbors, their flat plains making them vulnerable to invasion but their waterways giving them mobility. Control of the Mekong routes meant access to China's silk, India's spices, and maritime trade that carried goods as far as the Middle East. Angkor's wealth came not only from rice but from its position in this network of exchange, where geography placed it at the crossroads of continents. The Tunnel Sap, with its yearly flood, was more than a source of sustenance. It was a spiritual center. The Khmers, influenced by Indian cosmology, saw their land as a microcosm of the universe, with water as the life-giving force radiating from sacred Mount Meru. Temples were constructed as cosmic diagrams, reflecting the geography around them. Angkor Wat, built in the 12th century under Suryavarman II, was aligned with the sun and surrounded by moats that mirrored the oceans encircling the mythical mountain. Geography and religion fused into one vision of order, with rivers and lakes serving as both physical resources and spiritual metaphors. Yet the very forces that sustained Angkor also carried the seeds of fragility. The monsoon was unpredictable, and evidence from tree rings suggests that between the 14th and 15th centuries, Southeast Asia experienced decades-long droughts followed by intense flooding. The hydraulic system, once a triumph, strained under extremes it was not built to withstand. Canals clogged with silt, reservoirs dried or overflowed, and fields that had once yielded rice in abundance faltered. Geography, which had elevated the Khmer Empire to unmatched heights, now turned against it. Even as environmental pressures mounted, geography continued to shape the empire's fate. The rise of maritime trade in the 14th and 15th centuries shifted economic power toward coastal states. Ports along the Gulf of Thailand and the Mekong Delta grew in importance, while Angkor, located inland, was left increasingly isolated from the main arteries of commerce. The once advantageous location near the Tunnel Sap now became a liability as global trade networks bypassed the inland capital. By the mid-15th century, when Ayutthaya forces sacked Angkor in 1431, the empire was already weakened. The geography that had once sustained a great civilization now left it exposed. The Tunnel Sap still flooded, the Mekong still carried silt, but the infrastructure that had transformed these waters into imperial power was breaking apart. Angkor was abandoned, swallowed by forests, and the landscape returned to silence. Yet the geography remained. The Mekong continues to flood and retreat, the Tunnel Sap still reverses its flow, and the rice fields of Cambodia still yield harvests shaped by monsoon rains. The land itself carries memory, a record of how rivers, lakes, and plains once sustained one of the greatest civilizations of the medieval world. To understand the Khmer Empire is to understand the Mekong heartland, not as backdrop, but as the stage, the actor, and the script upon which history was written. In the year 802 CE, on the plateau of Phnom Kulen in present-day Cambodia, a man named Jayavarman II stood at the threshold of history and declared himself Chakravartin, a universal monarch. With that act, the Khmer Empire was born, and the trajectory of Southeast Asia shifted forever. This was not a sudden eruption from obscurity, but the culmination of centuries of cultural, political, and economic forces, sharpened into a single moment of assertion, where geography, religion, and ambition fused into a new order. Before Jayavarman II, the Mekong Basin had been a mosaic of polities rather than a unified state. The earliest recorded kingdom, Funan, rose in the 1st century CE, centered in the Mekong Delta. Funan's power rested on its control of maritime trade between India and China, with its ports serving as a vital link in the Indian Ocean network. By the 6th century, Funan's influence waned, replaced by Chenla, which shifted political gravity inland toward the Mekong heartland. Yet Chenla itself fragmented into multiple principalities by the 8th century, leaving the region vulnerable to foreign interference and internal division. It was in this fractured political landscape that Jayavarman II emerged, carving out unity from disarray. Sources on Jayavarman II are limited, but inscriptions provide the outlines of his ascent. He may have spent time in Java, where the Salandra dynasty ruled a powerful maritime empire in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Whether he was held there as a hostage or lived as an exile remains debated, but the influence of Javanese political models is evident in his later reforms. The notion of divine kingship, the Devaraja or God King, was adapted from Indic traditions, but its political articulation in Khmer lands was sharpened by external examples, particularly from Java, where centralized authority and monumental architecture were already reshaping societies. By the early 9th century, Jayavarman II had consolidated his base of power in the area of present-day Siem Reap. His move to Phnom Kulen, a mountain northeast of the Tunnel Sap, carried both practical and symbolic significance. Mountains in Southeast Asian cosmology were sacred, representing Mount Meru, the axis of the universe. By performing his consecration ritual there, Jayavarman II was not only legitimizing his kingship, but aligning himself with cosmic order, placing himself at the center of a sacred geography that bound heaven and earth. The ritual, performed under the guidance of a Brahmin priest named Hiranyadama, declared Jayavarman II freed from Javanese authority and established him as the independent universal monarch of the Khmer lands. This act severed external claims of dominance and unified the local principalities under his divine mandate. The ideology of Devaraja was not abstract philosophy, it was a tool of political consolidation. By fusing Hindu cosmology with royal authority, Jayavarman II elevated the king beyond mortal status. He became the living embodiment of Shiva on earth, with temples and rituals serving as both religious devotion and political affirmation. Loyalty to the king was framed not as allegiance to a man but as submission to divine order. This transformed the Khmer polity into more than a kingdom of men. It became an empire whose structure rested on the sacred authority of its ruler. The location of Jayavarman II's early capital was equally strategic. Situated near the Tunnel Sap and Mekong river systems, it provided access to abundant rice agriculture and facilitated control over regional trade routes. The fertility of the floodplains supported population growth, while the riverine networks allowed communication across the Khmer heartland. This geography, once harnessed by centralized power, became the lifeblood of the empire. The hydraulic projects that later defined Angkor, massive reservoirs and canals, had their conceptual roots in this period, when the relationship between water and authority began to crystallize under the new monarchy. The cultural synthesis that Jayavarman II established was equally significant. Indic influences had long entered Southeast Asia through trade, bringing Sanskrit, Hindu rituals, and Buddhist philosophies. Khmer elites adopted these ideas selectively, reshaping them to fit local traditions. The result was a hybrid political culture. Temples constructed as symbolic Mount Merus, inscriptions written in Sanskrit alongside Old Khmer, and rituals that bound divine authority to practical governance. This fusion gave the Khmer Empire a cultural distinctiveness that would endure for centuries, allowing it to radiate influence across Southeast Asia. Jayavarman II's reign, which lasted until approximately 850 CE, laid the foundations for future expansion, but it was only the beginning. His successors would build cities, temples, and hydraulic systems of unprecedented scale, but the principles that guided them were set during his reign. The divine mandate of the Devaraja, the integration of religious symbolism with political power, and the use of geography as both resource and ideology. By proclaiming himself Chakravartin at Phnom Kulen, Jayavarman II transformed a fragmented region into the beginnings of an empire that would dominate mainland Southeast Asia for more than 6 centuries. The inscriptions that reference him are terse, but their weight is undeniable. They speak of independence from foreign control, of a ritual consecration that bound the people to their monarch, of a ruler who shifted the axis of Khmer history. Archaeological remains in the Kulen area, temples carved from sandstone, reservoirs etched into the plateau, offer silent testimony to this formative era. These are not the colossal monuments of later Angkor, but they carry the first marks of an empire learning to inscribe its power upon the land. To understand the birth of Angkor is to grasp the convergence of political fragmentation, foreign influence, sacred geography, and royal ambition. Jayavarman II did not invent Khmer civilization, but he redefined it, giving it structure, ideology, and permanence. The 9th century was a turning point. What had once been shifting principalities became an empire, and what had once been local kings became god-kings. From Phnom Kulen outward, the Khmer Empire began to extend its reach, and with every canal dug, every temple raised, every ritual performed, the authority of the monarch expanded, rooted in that moment when Jayavarman II declared that his power came not from men but from the divine order itself. It was here, in the Mekong Basin in the 9th century, under the reign of Jayavarman II, that Angkor began its ascent, not in silence, but in the deliberate act of a ruler who bound geography, religion, and politics into one force and set in motion a history that would echo across Southeast Asia for centuries. The strength of Angkor was not measured only in armies, temples, or kings, but in water. The Khmer Empire's might rested on a landscape engineered with such precision that nature itself seemed to bend to royal will. Monsoons could bring months of unrelenting rain or seasons of searing drought, but through canals, reservoirs, and rice fields, the Khmers transformed uncertainty into abundance. Theirs was not simply an agricultural system. It was the foundation of a civilization that fed hundreds of thousands, sustained armies, and built monuments that demanded both wealth and stability. Water was survival, rice was prosperity, and power was the ability to control both. The Tunnel Sap Lake lay at the heart of this system, a body of water that expanded and contracted with the rhythm of the monsoon. Each year, from May to October, heavy rains swelled the Mekong River until it forced the Tunnel Sap to reverse its flow. The lake expanded from roughly 2,500 square kilometers to more than 12,000, flooding plains and forests, breeding fish in staggering numbers, and depositing fertile silt across the surrounding fields. Then, as the rains ended, the waters receded, leaving rich soil for rice cultivation and trapping fish in shrinking pools that provided food well into the dry season. This annual transformation was both predictable and precarious. The Khmers built a system to ensure that its benefits could be harnessed, extended, and multiplied. The first great projects began under the early Angkorian kings in the 9th century, but by the 11th and 12th centuries the hydraulic system had reached extraordinary scale. Massive barrages, man-made reservoirs, were constructed to hold and distribute water year-round. The East Barrage, completed under Yasovarman I around 900 CE, stretched nearly 7 kilometers in length and 1.8 kilometers in width. A century later, the West Barrage surpassed it, over 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, covering more than 16 square kilometers, with a capacity of some 50 million cubic meters of water. These were not natural lakes. They were vast, rectangular basins dug and embanked by human labor, designed to feed irrigation channels that carried life to the surrounding plains. The canals extended outward from these reservoirs, connecting villages, fields, and the capital itself. They were meticulously aligned with both practical and cosmological intent, often oriented to cardinal directions or temple axes, weaving religion and engineering into a single design. Water moved across the Angkorian landscape like blood through veins, distributed and redirected with astonishing control. Fields that once depended only on rainfall could now be irrigated year-round, enabling multiple harvests of rice. This agricultural surplus fed populations that may have reached close to 1 million at Angkor's peak, an urban concentration unmatched anywhere else in the medieval world outside of China. Rice was more than sustenance. It was the currency of empire. It sustained laborers who quarried sandstone and hauled it to temple sites. It supported armies that projected Khmer power across mainland Southeast Asia. It was offered in temples as a gift to the gods and redistributed by kings to demonstrate divine authority made tangible in food. Each harvest reinforced the bond between monarch and subject. The people tilled and planted, but the king, through mastery of water, ensured that the harvest would not fail. Divine kingship was not an abstraction. It was measured in full granaries and thriving villages. The engineering skill required to sustain such a system was immense. Canals had to maintain slight gradients to allow water to flow over long distances without stagnation. Reservoirs demanded strong embankments lined with laterite or sandstone to prevent erosion. Maintenance was constant. A neglected canal clogged with silt could disrupt entire networks of irrigation. Yet the Khmers maintained these systems for centuries, adapting them as cities shifted and rulers demanded new projects. Archaeological surveys using modern technologies like LiDAR have revealed an intricate grid of canals, dikes, ponds, and fields stretching across hundreds of square kilometers. A landscape as engineered as any built by Rome or China. The system was also vulnerable. Its scale made it powerful but also fragile. Seasonal variations could strain its capacity. Too much rain could flood canals, wash away embankments, and destroy crops. Too little could leave reservoirs half-empty, fields parched, and rice yields reduced. Evidence from tree-ring studies suggests that from the 14th to the 15th centuries, the region experienced prolonged droughts punctuated by catastrophic floods. These extremes placed unprecedented pressure on the hydraulic system. Canals silted, reservoirs cracked, and the delicate balance between monsoon and engineering collapsed. The very infrastructure that had supported Angkor for centuries became a liability when climate turned against it. The hydraulic city was not simply about agriculture. It was about order. The control of water symbolized the control of the cosmos. Temples like Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom were surrounded by moats, not merely for defense but as reflections of the cosmic ocean encircling Mount Meru, the sacred axis of Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. The berets themselves, vast and rectangular, echoed cosmic seas, aligning earthly landscapes with divine models. By controlling water, the king was not only feeding his people. He was sustaining the universe itself. The connection between water, rice, and power extended beyond the heartland. Khmer expansion into surrounding territories often followed river valleys, seeking control of fertile lands and trade routes. Victories in war brought tribute not only in gold or slaves but in rice, which fed the capital and allowed further expansion. The ability to redistribute surplus secured loyalty from local elites, who relied on royal support to maintain their own positions. Control of the hydraulic network meant control of the political order. Even today, the remnants of Angkor's water system remain visible. Embankments stretching across the forest, canals still faintly marking the earth, berets that still hold water after more than 1,000 years. They testify to an engineering achievement that rivaled any of its contemporaries. They also bear the scars of strain, the evidence of repairs, modifications, and eventual decline. Scholars debate whether environmental failure was the decisive factor in Angkor's collapse, or whether political and economic shifts played greater roles. What is certain is that without the mastery of water, there could have been no Angkor. The Khmer Empire's hydraulic city was both its strength and its weakness, a system that turned unpredictable monsoons into predictable harvests, but one that demanded constant maintenance and favorable conditions. Its grandeur lay not in the mystery of stone temples alone, but in the rice fields that stretched for miles, fed by waters carried through canals dug by countless hands, directed by rulers who understood that true power was not in conquest alone but in the ability to feed millions. Angkor's temples were not built as monuments to kings alone. They were conceived as maps of the universe, stone recreations of the cosmos where the divine and the earthly were fused into one. Among them, Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom stand as the greatest architectural expressions of Khmer ambition, faith, and power, structures that embodied both Hindu and Buddhist traditions in their stone, their alignment, and their vast scale. They were not isolated sanctuaries but centers of political authority, religious devotion, and cultural identity, constructed in a language of architecture that could be read by all who approached their gates. Angkor Wat, commissioned in the early 12th century by King Suryavarman II, remains the largest religious monument in the world. Its construction began around 1113 CE and continued into the 1150s, a project requiring tens of thousands of laborers, artisans, and architects. Built primarily of sandstone blocks transported from quarries at the Kulen Mountains, some 40 kilometers to the northeast, the temple represented not just devotion to Vishnu but the king's claim to eternal sovereignty. Unlike earlier Khmer temples, which were dedicated to Shiva, Angkor, what was oriented to the west, associated in Hindu cosmology with Vishnu, and also symbolically tied to death and the setting sun. This alignment suggests that the temple was designed not only as a place of worship, but also as a funerary complex for Suryavarman II himself. The layout of Angkor, what reflected the Hindu conception of the universe. At its center rose 5 towers arranged in a quincunx, symbolizing the peaks of Mount Meru, the axis of the cosmos. The surrounding galleries and moats represented the encircling mountain ranges and cosmic oceans. The central tower, rising to a height of 65 meters, was the symbolic summit, accessible only to the initiated, a sacred axis linking Earth to heaven. Approaching the temple meant moving through layers of the cosmos, crossing moats, causeways, and successive enclosures, each step narrowing the space until the pilgrim reached the heart of divine presence. The temple's surfaces were covered with reliefs, among the longest continuous bas-reliefs in the world. Stretching over 800 meters, these carvings depicted Hindu epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the churning of the ocean of milk, a scene of gods and demons pulling the Naga serpent Vasuki to stir the cosmic sea, producing the nectar of immortality. The reliefs were not decoration. They were scripture in stone, a sacred text spread across walls, narrating the eternal struggle between order and chaos, dharma and adharma, within which the Khmer king presented himself as the earthly guarantor of balance. Angkor Wat scale required not only religious devotion but also political power and logistical mastery. Each sandstone block, weighing up to 1.5 tons, had to be cut, transported, and set in place with precision. Engineers designed corbelled arches, galleries, and stairways that rose steeply to symbolize spiritual ascent. The moat surrounding the temple, over 190 meters wide, required a massive investment of labor, both practical and symbolic, a reflection of the cosmic ocean and a defensive feature protecting the sacred precinct. The construction of Angkor Wat was, in essence, the projection of Suryavarman II's kingship in stone, a declaration that he ruled not only a kingdom but also a cosmos. Half a century later, Angkor Thom rose as a different yet equally monumental expression of power. Established by King Jayavarman VII after 1181 CE, following the Cham invasion that had briefly captured Angkor in 1177, the city was both a fortress and a statement of recovery. Enclosed by walls 8 meters high and 12 kilometers long, surrounded by a moat crossed by monumental causeways, Angkor Thom was a declaration that the Khmer Empire had not only survived but had reasserted itself with greater force. At its heart stood the Bayon, a temple unlike any other, its towers adorned with massive stone faces that have become the most recognizable image of Angkor. The Bayon marked a significant religious shift. Jayavarman VII was a devout Mahayana Buddhist, and his temple reflected this transformation. While Angkor Wat had been dedicated to Vishnu, the Bayon was conceived as a Buddhist temple mountain, yet it retained the cosmic symbolism of Mount Meru. Its most striking feature was the more than 200 serene faces carved onto 54 towers, gazing outward in 4 directions. Scholars debate whether these faces represent the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, embodying compassion, or Jayavarman VII himself, portrayed as a divine ruler. The ambiguity itself reveals the blending of religion and kingship, where the king became both devotee and incarnation, ruler and enlightened being. The reliefs of the Bayon offered a different vision from those of Angkor Wat. Instead of epic Hindu battles, they depicted scenes of daily life and historical events. Markets, fishing, naval battles, and the Khmer army confronting the Khams. These carvings humanized the monument, binding divine kingship to the everyday lives of the people, and anchoring the empire's history in stone alongside its cosmology. Through them, Jayavarman VII projected not only his role as a Buddhist king, but as the protector of his people, a ruler whose legitimacy came from compassion as well as power. The architecture of Angkor Thom extended beyond the Bayon. The city included the Baphuon, an earlier temple that Jayavarman incorporated, the Terrace of the Elephants, used for royal ceremonies, and the Terrace of the Leper King, adorned with intricate carvings of celestial beings. Together, these constructions reflected a synthesis of religious traditions, Hindu deities and Buddhist bodhisattvas coexisted in stone, as the Khmer Empire absorbed, reinterpreted, and redefined Indic traditions to serve its own cultural and political identity. The blending of Hindu and Buddhist architecture was not a matter of tolerance alone, but of political pragmatism. By the late 12th century, Buddhism had gained deep roots in Khmer society, appealing to both elites and commoners. Jayavarman VII harnessed its emphasis on compassion and merit to reinforce his kingship after a period of war and crisis. Yet Hindu traditions remained embedded in the empire's structures, rituals, and cosmology. Temples built after his reign often shifted between the two faiths, with statues of Buddha later replaced by lingas of Shiva or vice versa, reflecting both the fluidity and tension between traditions. Architecture became the canvas upon which this religious negotiation was written. The scale and complexity of Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom cannot be separated from the empire's capacity for organization. The hydraulic system sustained the labor force, rice surpluses fed workers, and wealth from trade-funded construction. Each stone, each carving was tied to the larger system of water, rice, and power. These temples were the pinnacle of Khmer engineering and artistry, but also the physical manifestation of a political order that bound together religion, economy, and authority in one structure. What emerged in these temples was a cultural synthesis unparalleled in the medieval world. Hindu cosmology given form in Angkor Wat, Buddhist compassion carved into the Bayon, and a political theology that fused divine kingship with monumental architecture. They were not static monuments but living centers of worship, administration, and legitimacy. Their stones carried inscriptions of prayers, genealogies of kings, and declarations of conquest, embedding history into architecture. The Khmer kings who built these temples sought more than devotion. They sought permanence. They aligned their cities with the cosmos, their towers with the heavens, their reliefs with eternal epics. The stones still stand, not as ruins stripped of meaning, but as echoes of a time when architecture was the language of divinity, and when the power of a king was measured not in fleeting victories but in the ability to build a universe from earth and stone. The rise of Angkor into its golden age was not a sudden spark but the result of centuries of calculated power, ambition, and adaptation. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Khmer Empire had turned its mastery over water, agriculture, and monumental architecture into the foundations of a world power. Its territories stretched across present-day Cambodia, Laos, southern Vietnam, and parts of Thailand, transforming Angkor into the largest city on Earth at the time, housing perhaps 750,000 people when Paris barely held 50,000. This scale was not simply the product of conquest, but the outcome of a vast economic system that tied rice fields to temples, markets to waterways, and diplomacy to the flow of goods across Asia. The empire's prosperity rested on a hydraulic system so advanced that it still puzzles modern engineers. Reservoirs, barrages, measured in kilometers, with the West Barrage stretching over 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, held water to feed sprawling irrigation canals. These waters sustained the endless rice fields that made surplus not only possible but reliable, supporting armies, artisans, and a growing urban class. It was this surplus that allowed the Khmer to project power far beyond their borders. Rice from Angkor was not just food, it was currency, security, and political leverage. Trade became the artery of expansion. By the reign of Suryavarman II in the early 12th century, Angkor stood at the crossroads of Asia. The Mekong River connected the empire to China's southern ports, while overland routes tied it to the Indian Ocean trade. Chinese records from the Song dynasty, particularly the accounts of Zhou Daguan, describe Khmer embassies arriving with gifts of precious woods, ivory, and aromatics. In exchange, Chinese traders brought silks, ceramics, and metal goods that enriched the Khmer elite. From India came cotton, beads, and religious texts, embedding layers of Hindu and later Buddhist traditions into Angkor's cultural life. Gold, mined in the hills of Cambodia and Laos, added yet another thread to the empire's global ties. Diplomacy with China was not optional, it was strategic. The Khmer kings knew that acknowledgement from the Middle Kingdom offered prestige and legitimacy. Tribute missions recorded in the Chinese annals served both symbolic and material purposes. A Khmer embassy in 1116, under Suryavarman II, delivered products of the forest, rhinoceros horns, and spices, securing recognition that elevated the Khmer ruler in the regional hierarchy. Such missions were far from one-sided exchanges of gifts. They were calculated acts of statecraft, ensuring Angkor's access to the lucrative trade networks dominated by Chinese merchants. India's influence was less formal but equally powerful. Sanskrit remained the language of royal inscriptions, and Hindu cosmology defined the urban and spiritual landscape of Angkor. Temples were not mere places of worship but embodiments of Mount Meru, the mythical axis of the universe. The construction of Angkor, what around 1122 under Suryavarman II, was the clearest statement of this vision. Built as both a state temple and a funerary monument, it proclaimed the king's connection to Vishnu while binding his rule to cosmic order. Yet the same empire that anchored itself in Hindu tradition also absorbed Buddhist thought, particularly through contact with Sri Lanka and India's Buddhist centers. By the late 12th century, under Jayavarman VII, Angkor became a bastion of Mahayana Buddhism, filling its temples with images of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara and replacing Vedic sacrifice with compassion-centered rituals. Military expansion underpinned this cultural and economic flowering. Suryavarman II campaigned in present-day Vietnam and Thailand, asserting Khmer dominance over the Mon kingdoms of Dvaravati and Harapunjaya. His reign saw Angkor's reach extend across the Mekong Basin, pressing against Kampa in central Vietnam and clashing with the Dai Viet in the north. These campaigns were not solely about land, but about securing trade routes, ports, and resources vital for sustaining the empire's prosperity. At the same time, Angkor's cosmopolitan character grew. Traders from Arabia and Persia passed through the empire, drawn by its access to Southeast Asia's resources. Archaeological evidence, including imported ceramics and coins, confirms that Angkor was tied to a network stretching from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea. This interconnectedness made the Khmer capital not just a political center but an international hub, where goods, ideas, and beliefs collided and fused. The Golden Age of Angkor was therefore as much about synthesis as it was about conquest. Nowhere was this more visible than in its architecture. Angkor Thom, built under Jayavarman VII in the late 12th century, stood as a walled city that embodied Buddhist kingship. Its central temple, the Bayon, with its massive stone faces staring in all directions, symbolized both spiritual guardianship and political surveillance. Every road, canal, and temple complex was aligned with astronomical precision, tying the empire's spiritual world to the cycles of the cosmos. Infrastructure extended beyond grandeur. Roads linked Angkor to its provinces, punctuated by rest houses and bridges commissioned by the kings. Inscriptions detail hospitals and reservoirs built under Jayavarman VII, projecting a vision of kingship that fused military might with public welfare. This was not altruism but a calculated political ideology. The king as the universal monarch, sustaining his people materially and spiritually. What made this golden age unique was its capacity to balance power and belief. The Khmer rulers did not merely absorb influences, they transformed them. Indian deities became Khmer deities, Chinese goods became Khmer wealth, Buddhist compassion became Khmer authority. The empire's expansion was not only territorial but ideological, pulling in strands from across Asia and weaving them into a distinctly Khmer fabric. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity lay fragility. The very scale of the hydraulic system demanded constant maintenance. Trade routes depended on favorable monsoon cycles and stable regional relations. Diplomatic recognition from China required ongoing tribute. Even at its height, Angkor was a world built on perpetual motion, never still, always requiring energy to sustain its momentum. The Golden Age of Angkor was not just a chapter of dominance, but a moment when geography, economy, religion, and power converged with precision. Rice fed the population, trade connected it to empires far away, temples sanctified kingship, and diplomacy kept its prestige intact. Every canal, every embassy, every carved relief in stone spoke to an empire convinced of its centrality in the world. It was this conviction, supported by irrigation, cemented by diplomacy, and proclaimed in stone, that allowed Angkor to reign as Southeast Asia's mightiest power for centuries, an empire whose legacy still dominates the landscape of Cambodia. The Khmer Empire, which had stood for centuries as the most formidable power in mainland Southeast Asia, did not collapse in a single moment of conquest or disaster. Its decline was slow, uneven, and filled with pressures both from within and beyond its borders. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the grandeur of Angkor, the city that once held hundreds of thousands, sustained by canals and reservoirs, and adorned with temples larger than European cathedrals, was already strained under the weight of its own ambitions. What had once been the empire's greatest strength, its mastery of water management, its centralization of wealth, its control of regional trade, would in time expose it to weakness. The land itself began to shift against its rulers. For centuries, Angkor's prosperity had depended on a complex hydraulic system, vast reservoirs known as barays, and canals that carried water to rice fields spread across the floodplains. This network allowed the Khmer to harvest rice up to 3 times per year, feeding their massive population and supporting the construction of temples and armies. But studies of sediment layers and tree rings reveal that between the 14th and 15th centuries, Cambodia suffered violent climatic swings. Decades of severe drought followed by sudden, destructive floods. The monsoon cycle became erratic, drying reservoirs and then overwhelming them. Angkor's great waterworks, so carefully engineered in the reigns of Suryavarman II and Jayavarman VII, cracked under the stress. Canals silted up, embankments collapsed, and farmers found themselves unable to produce the surpluses that had sustained the capital. The empire's heartland, once a marvel of human control over nature, became increasingly vulnerable to the very environment it had sought to master. While nature pressed hard from one side, human pressures bore down from another. Angkor had been built as much on trade as on rice. For centuries, it thrived as an intermediary between the Indian Ocean world and China, funneling forest goods, ivory, precious stones, and spices through its markets. But global routes shifted in the 14th century. The rise of maritime commerce, dominated increasingly by ports along the coasts of Vietnam, Siam, and the Malay world, pulled wealth away from Angkor's inland capital. Chinese merchants, who had once regarded Angkor as a central destination, began to favor Ayutthaya, Malacca, and other emerging ports. Angkor, built deep in the interior, found itself bypassed by the sea trade that now defined regional power. As wealth drained, so too did authority. The Khmer kings had long legitimized their rule by building monuments, sponsoring temples, and ensuring prosperity through irrigation. But when these foundations weakened, rivals grew bolder. To the west, a new kingdom rose on the Chao Phraya River basin, Ayutthaya, founded in 1350. Its rulers were aggressive, militarily skilled, and quick to seize advantage from Khmer weakness. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, Ayutthayan armies pressed into Khmer territory, raiding towns, seizing captives, and even threatening Angkor itself. The Khmer court, still rooted in its traditions, faced an enemy that combined battlefield strength with access to coastal trade networks that Angkor lacked. The wars were devastating. In 1431, after years of conflict, Ayutthayan forces besieged Angkor. The city that had once been the beating heart of an empire stretching from the Mekong Delta to the mountains of Laos was broken. Its population, weakened by famine and strained resources, could not resist the pressure of a more mobile, commercially connected state. Contemporary accounts describe mass captures, deportations of artisans and scholars, and the sacking of temples. The Khmer elite shifted their political center southward, toward Phnom Penh and later Odong, closer to the Mekong and the routes of maritime commerce. This was not a single abandonment but rather a long retreat, as Angkor's monumental core became increasingly irrelevant to the new centers of power. The city itself, once unparalleled in scale, began to empty. Without the constant labor needed to maintain its reservoirs and canals, the water system deteriorated further. Forests crept back into the spaces once cleared for fields and temples. Angkor Wat, that towering symbol of Khmer ingenuity, remained a site of pilgrimage and worship, first for Hindus, then increasingly for Theravada Buddhists. But the surrounding city, which may once have been home to 500,000 people, dwindled into ruins. It was not destroyed in an instant but hollowed out by decades of pressure. Ecological breakdown, economic shifts, and relentless wars. The change in religion also marked a deeper transformation. While the great temples had originally been built for Hindu deities and Mahayana Buddhist ideals of kingship, the spread of Theravada Buddhism from Sri Lanka across mainland Southeast Asia gradually reshaped Khmer society. Theravada Buddhism did not require massive temples or divine kingship to thrive. Its practices were centered in local monasteries, supported by community donations. This shift undercut the old system that had tied the people's labor and devotion directly to the God King and his monumental projects. Angkor's political and religious foundations no longer aligned, further eroding the legitimacy of its rulers. By the late 15th century, Angkor was no longer the capital of an empire. The Khmer kingdom survived, but its center of gravity had shifted permanently southward. The great stone faces of Bayon, the towers of Angkor Wat, the avenues of Angkor Thom stood silent, their meanings transformed but their physical presence enduring. The forests swallowed the outer districts, the canals filled with mud. Travelers from later centuries, first from neighboring lands, then from the wider world, would marvel at the scale of the ruins, unable to reconcile the forgotten city with the diminished kingdom that lingered nearby. Yet even in its decline, Angkor was not erased. Its temples continued to function as sacred sites, maintained by small communities of monks and villagers who refused to let them vanish entirely. The empire's political order had collapsed. Its trade networks had been overtaken. Its irrigation system had failed, but its stone monuments remained. They bore silent witness to the centuries when the Khmer reigned supreme over Southeast Asia, and to the long, painful unraveling that followed. The fall of Angkor was not the end of Khmer civilization, but the end of an age when kings could command the resources of 500,000 subjects to carve entire cities from stone and earth. What nature weakened, trade diverted, and enemies exploited, time itself sealed. Yet the ruins, vast and enduring, ensured that the memory of Angkor never fully died, even as the empire that built it slipped into silence. By the early 19th century, Angkor had already passed into silence. Its once vibrant avenues were empty, its colossal stone temples concealed by centuries of encroaching vegetation. For locals, the ruins had never been forgotten. They remained sacred places, folded into Buddhist practice and Khmer memory. But to the wider world, Angkor was a shadow, a rumor, until European explorers, traders, and colonial agents pushed into Cambodia's interior and carried news of the ruins back to foreign capitals. Their reports set in motion a wave of fascination, scholarship, and eventually control, entangling Angkor's stones not only with archaeology but also with colonial ambition. In 1586, the Portuguese missionary Antonio de Madalena became one of the earliest Europeans to write about Angkor, describing Angkor Wat as a structure so extraordinary that it seemed impossible to describe. Yet his words circulated only sparsely. For centuries afterward, Angkor remained largely unregistered in European scholarly circles, though known to Asian travelers and deeply tied to Khmer cultural continuity. It was not until the 1850s that the ruins began to pull sustained attention from abroad. The turning point came in 1860, when Henri Mouhot, a French naturalist traveling through Siam, Laos, and Cambodia, published his vivid accounts. Mouhot marveled at the scale of Angkor Wat, comparing its magnificence to the greatest monuments of antiquity. His writings, released in Europe after his death in 1861, electrified audiences, presenting Angkor as a lost city reclaimed from the jungle, even though in truth it had never been forgotten by Cambodians themselves. The image of Angkor as a lost world resonated with a Europe captivated by Orientalist fascination and colonial expansion. France, in particular, seized upon Angkor as both a cultural trophy and a justification for its growing imperial interests in Southeast Asia. By 1863, France had established a protectorate over Cambodia under King Norodom, embedding itself into the region's political landscape. Angkor suddenly was not just a monument of the past but a symbol woven into colonial legitimacy. Its rediscovery was framed less as Cambodia's heritage and more as a jewel to be catalogued, studied, and displayed by outsiders. The late 19th century brought the beginnings of systematic archaeological work under French supervision. In 1898, The École Française d'Extrême-Orient (EFEO) was founded in Hanoi, and by 1907, after negotiations with Siam, the Angkor region was formally integrated into French-administered Cambodia. The EFEO scholars took charge of Angkor's preservation, launching extensive surveys, clearing vegetation, and beginning restoration efforts. Figures such as Henri Marchal and Jean Kamel became central to the conservation of the ruins, experimenting with techniques like anastylosis, carefully reconstructing fallen structures using original materials. This process, though innovative, also reflected the colonial belief that Europeans were the rightful custodians of Asia's antiquities. During these decades, Angkor what became an emblem of grandeur, yet also a canvas upon which colonial powers projected their narratives. French scholars emphasized Angkor as evidence of a glorious Khmer civilization that had long since collapsed, implicitly suggesting that modern Cambodians were inheritors of greatness they could no longer sustain without European guidance. This interpretation ignored the continuous cultural significance of Angkor in Khmer society, where monks maintained temples, villagers recounted stories, and rituals kept the sites alive. The colonial rediscovery was not the beginning of Angkor's story, but rather the beginning of its appropriation into another. By the early 20th century, Angkor's fame had spread worldwide. Photographs circulated through European journals, drawing scholars, tourists, and adventurers. Restoration projects intensified in the 1920s and 1930s, with major work on Angkor Wat, Bayon, and Ta Prohm. Roads were built to ease access, and Angkor was framed increasingly as both an archaeological treasure and a destination for colonial tourism. This visibility expanded even further after 1909 when the French organized exhibitions in Europe, presenting Angkor's bas-reliefs and architectural models to captivated audiences in Paris. Yet the rediscovery was not without its tensions. The very act of clearing jungle growth, while essential to preservation, also changed the way Angkor was perceived. Structures that for centuries had stood within dense vegetation were stripped bare, their relationship with the surrounding environment altered to fit European ideals of how ruins should look. Temples were presented as isolated monuments, carefully curated to fit the narrative of timeless relics of a vanished civilization. The lived reality of Cambodian villagers who continued to use and inhabit the sacred spaces was often overlooked, marginalized by the colonial gaze. World events shaped the rhythm of Angkor's rediscovery as well. During World War II, Japanese forces occupied Cambodia, and although French scholars continued some conservation, the site's international profile dimmed. After the war, the EFEO resumed its efforts, but Cambodia's political trajectory shifted rapidly toward independence. In 1953, the country freed itself from French rule under King Norodom Sihanouk, and with independence came a new chapter in Angkor's place in Cambodian identity. No longer framed as a colonial possession, Angkor became a national symbol. Its silhouette, with the iconic towers of Angkor Wat, was placed on the national flag, a visual assertion that the ruins were not remnants of a lost civilization but the living emblem of a sovereign people. Even in independence, the legacy of the 19th century rediscovery remained. French scholarship had documented, preserved, and at times reinterpreted Angkor, shaping how the world understood the ruins. But Cambodians reclaimed them with renewed force, grounding their heritage not in foreign texts, but in their own memory and nationhood. In modern Cambodia, Angkor stands not only as a monument to the Khmer Empire, but also as a reminder of colonial intrusion, global fascination, and cultural resilience. The rediscovery in the 19th century brought Angkor into the global spotlight, but it also entangled the site in a history of power, appropriation, and contested meanings. The French archaeologists and explorers who pushed through the forests believed they were reviving a forgotten world. Yet Angkor had never disappeared. It had always stood, weathering centuries, waiting as a living presence in the hearts of Cambodians. The story of Angkor's rediscovery is thus inseparable from the broader history of Southeast Asia in the Age of Empire. It was a story of maps redrawn, artifacts catalogued, and identities contested. The 19th century did not awaken Angkor. It simply shifted who was telling its story, and in whose interest that story was told. The temples, carved in stone, outlasted every interpretation placed upon them, as they had outlasted kingdoms and wars. And while the colonial era passed, Angkor remained, claimed once again by Cambodia as the unshakable heart of its heritage, even as scholars and tourists from every corner of the world continued to walk through its ancient gates. The Niger River is not a mere body of water. It is a force that carved civilizations into existence, a line of life that dictated where people could build, where kings could rule, and where empires could rise. Stretching more than 4,000 kilometers in a great arc across West Africa, from the Fouta Djallon Highlands in modern Guinea through Mali and Niger before bending south into Nigeria, its shape and path defy simplicity. Unlike most rivers that flow in one clear direction, the Niger bends and twists, first heading northeast into the Sahara before turning southeast toward the Gulf of Guinea. That strange course was no accident of chance. It was the hand of geology, pulling people into its orbit, forcing them to adapt to its shifting nature, and shaping the destinies of kingdoms that lived or died by its waters. The Sahel, the belt of land stretching between the arid Sahara and the wetter savannas to the south, became the crucible of early state formation because of this river. Here, rainfall was never reliable, and the desert pressed constantly against human ambition. But the Niger offered a counterweight. Its seasonal floods deposited fertile soils, turning banks into farmlands where millet, sorghum, and later rice could grow. Fishing communities thrived, their boats cutting across channels with nets weighted down by stone. The river was both farmland and highway. Those who controlled its crossings, its ports, and its fertile bends could command wealth beyond measure. This is why kingdoms formed not in the empty stretches of sand, but along the arteries where the Niger's life-giving waters reached. By the first millennium CE, settlements clustered along the river's middle arc, where the Sahara met the savannah. The river made it possible for the Sahel to serve as a bridge between two worlds, the desert caravans of North Africa and the agricultural societies of the forest belt to the south. Salt, cut from the desert's ancient beds, was carried on camel caravans and exchanged for gold extracted from the soils of Bambuk and Bure. Without the Niger, these exchanges would have remained fragile, broken by distances too vast and deserts too unforgiving. With the river, the Sahel became a trade nexus, and kingdoms rose to guard and tax its lifeblood. The earliest of these was Ghana, flourishing between the 8th and 11th centuries. Centered not directly on the Niger but close enough to control trade routes feeding into it, Ghana drew its power from the river's geography. Merchants from the north reached the towns where the Niger's influence spread, and local rulers ensured that no salt, no gold, no ivory passed without their levy. Control of water meant control of land, and control of land meant power over trade. The Niger's bends and branches created natural corridors that men sought to dominate. Ghana's fall in the 11th century, weakened by pressures from the Almoravid expansion and internal fractures, did not erase the river's role. It only shifted power downstream. By the 13th century, Mali rose from the heart of the Niger Bend. This was no coincidence. The bend, where the river sweeps north before curving south again, formed a basin of extraordinary fertility. It was here that Sundiata Keita built his foundations, and here that Mansa Musa would reign in the early 14th century, transforming Mali into one of the wealthiest empires the world had ever known. The river carried grain to feed his people, cattle grazed along its floodplains, and boats laden with goods plied its channels. When Mansa Musa set out on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, the gold he carried had been collected from lands nourished by the Niger and transported along its waters. His empire's prosperity was inseparable from the river that cut through its core. Yet geography was never passive. The Niger also carried risks. Floods could be unpredictable, shifting channels destroyed settlements, and the wetlands bred disease. Empires that depended too heavily on controlling one stretch of its banks found themselves vulnerable when trade routes moved or when rival states controlled alternate passages. This was the fate of Mali, which in the 15th century began to lose its grip on the river's arteries. Out of this vacuum rose Songhai, whose capital, Gao, lay directly on the Niger's banks. Songhai's rulers understood the river as no other empire had before. Under Sunni Ali are 1464 to 1492, and Askia Muhammad are 1493 to 1528. Fleets of war canoes patrolled the waters, asserting dominance over towns along its course. Gao's position allowed Songhai to command the river trade while projecting military power both north into the desert and south into the savanna. The Niger was a weapon as much as a resource. Control of ferries meant control of armies. Mastery of river routes meant mastery of commerce. But even empires as vast as Songhai could not escape the pressures geography imposed. The river's ability to connect also meant vulnerability. In 1591, Moroccan forces armed with gunpowder weapons crossed the desert and shattered Songhai at the Battle of Tondabai. A clash made possible because trade routes linked Morocco to the Niger Bend. The same geography that enriched kingdoms also opened them to conquest. Still, the Niger did not cease to shape lives after the fall of Songhai. Local polities, city-states, and trading communities continued to thrive along its course. Timbuktu, Jen, and Gao remained magnets for scholars and merchants, their prosperity tied to the constant pulse of the river. Even as European powers in the 19th century sought to redraw Africa's borders, their expeditions traced the Niger's course, seeking the source and mouth of the river as keys to domination. Geography had made the Niger central for millennia, and imperial powers knew it would remain so. The story of the Sahelian kingdoms cannot be told apart from the Niger. Its geography dictated the lines of power, the routes of armies, the rhythms of trade. It forced adaptation, demanded resilience, and offered rewards that could make empires the equal of any in the world. The kingdoms that rose on its banks were not accidents. They were responses to the demands and gifts of the river, carved by its bends, its floods, its relentless path across a landscape where survival itself depended on water. And as the Niger wound its way through history, it left behind not only empires but the memory of a land where geography itself was the first and greatest ruler. At the heart of West Africa in the 11th century stood a kingdom that outsiders called Ghana, though its rulers named it Ouagadougou. It was not Ghana as known today, but a vast empire stretching across the Sahel, anchored between the Senegal and Niger rivers. With its wealth rooted in the gold fields of Bambouk and Bouré, Arab chroniclers such as al-Bakri, writing in 1067 from distant Cordoba, described a court glittering with power. The king sitting in state, draped in fine robes, surrounded by dogs adorned with gold and silver, and ministers carrying shields and swords of imported iron. This was a world sustained by trade, for Ghana controlled the arteries of commerce that connected the Sahara to the forests of the south. Gold moved north. Salt, copper, textiles, and horses flowed south. Every caravan that crossed the desert passed through Ghana's gate, paying taxes that enriched its rulers and gave the empire an authority unmatched in its time. Yet the same geography that gave Ghana strength exposed it to relentless pressure. To the north lay the Berber Almoravids, zealous warriors of the Sahara who in the mid-11th century sought both wealth and religious authority. Their campaigns reached into the Sahel by the 1070s, and tradition holds that they clashed with Ghana, striking at the capital, Kumbisala. While historians debate whether the Almoravids truly conquered Ghana or merely weakened it through raids and economic disruption, the outcome was the same. Ghana's supremacy fractured. Trade routes shifted. New centers of power rose in the interior. By the early 12th century, the empire that had once dominated West Africa was reduced to a fading memory, its authority contested by rising local kingdoms and its grasp over trade slipping away. It was into this fractured landscape that a new power began to rise, not on the edges but at the core of the Niger Basin. The Mandinka people, scattered across small chiefdoms in the region of Kingaba, were bound together by ties of language and culture but divided politically. Oral traditions, preserved in the Epic of Sundiata, tell of a ruler named Samaro Kante of the Sasso, who rose from the ruins of Ghana to dominate the Mandinka and impose his power with ruthless force. The Sasso seized control of the trade routes, plundering neighboring lands, and with them emerged the shadow of tyranny in the western Sahel. Yet resistance brewed within the Mandinka, and at its center was a man who would transform the destiny of West Africa, Sundiata Keita. Sundiata was born around 1217 in Niani, a small Mandinka town that would later become his capital. He was the son of Nair Maghen Konate, ruler of Kingaba, and his second wife Sagalin, from whom he inherited a prophecy-laden destiny. Tradition describes him as a child who could not walk for many years, mocked and dismissed by rivals at court. Yet in this weakness lay the seeds of his myth, for when he finally stood, he rose with a force that symbolized both resilience and inevitability. While these accounts passed through generations of griots, weave legend with fact. What stands clear in the historical record is that Sundiata grew into a leader capable of uniting fragmented clans against Saso domination. By the 1230s, the Mandinka resistance had matured into open war. Sundiata forged alliances with rival chiefs, consolidating a coalition against Samaro. The decisive confrontation came in 1235 at the Battle of Karina, a clash remembered in both oral tradition and regional history as the turning point of West Africa's political order. Samaro was defeated, his power broken, and with his fall the Saso faded into obscurity. In victory, Sundiata did more than liberate his people. He laid the foundations of the Mali Empire, a state that would endure for centuries and surpass Ghana in wealth, culture, and influence. The creation of Mali was not merely a transfer of power but a deliberate restructuring of authority. Sundiata convened the Bara, a grand assembly of nobles and clans, where the laws and organization of the new empire were established. Through oral constitutions remembered as the Kurukan Fuga, Mali was divided into provinces with loyal governors, and clans were assigned roles: warriors, priests, traders, and griots, ensuring stability through a balance of responsibility. This system embedded cohesion in the empire's core, transforming the coalition that defeated the Saso into a durable political order. Geography again dictated Mali's strength. The empire's heartland along the Niger River allowed agriculture to flourish, producing millet, sorghum, and rice to sustain its population. Control of goldfields at Bambuk, Bure, and later Lobi guaranteed economic supremacy. The empire commanded caravan routes stretching north to Morocco and east to Egypt, making Mali the central axis of trans-Saharan trade. Salt from Tagaza, horses from the Maghreb, and luxury goods from distant Mediterranean markets passed through its cities, enriching its rulers and merchants. By the mid-13th century, Niani and other urban centers began to thrive as hubs of commerce and administration, drawing not only traders but scholars and artisans. The rise of Sundiata Keita thus marked the transition from the world of Ghana to the ascendance of Mali. Ghana's decline had left a vacuum in the Sahel, but the Mandinka, under a leader whose vision fused myth with political genius, filled it with a new order that was stronger, richer, and more enduring. Sundiata's reign, stretching from 1235 until his death around 1255, forged the empire that would later produce rulers such as Mansa Musa, whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 would astonish the Islamic world with displays of wealth unprecedented in scale. Yet even in its early years, the empire bore the hallmarks of greatness: stability through structured governance, prosperity through trade, and unity forged in the crucible of resistance. The fall of Ghana and the rise of Mali were not simply successive stages of empire, but a shift in the balance of West Africa's political and economic power. Where Ghana had thrived on control of trade, Mali expanded that control and rooted it in a broader system of governance. Where Ghana's story had ended with fragmentation, Mali's began with cohesion. And at the heart of that transformation stood Sundiata Keita, remembered not merely as a conqueror but as a founder, a lawgiver, and the architect of a state that would define the history of West Africa for centuries to come. Sundiata Keita was not born into a position of power, but into a world fractured by ambition, betrayal, and conquest. His rise from exile to empire remains one of the most defining narratives in African history, not because of legend alone, but because it forged the foundations of one of the most enduring states of West Africa, the Mali Empire. The founding epic of Sundiata cannot be separated from the collapse of Ghana and the wars of succession in the Sahel. Out of chaos and shifting allegiances, a single man consolidated power and built a new order that would stand as a model for centuries. The early 13th century in West Africa was a time of instability. The Ghana Empire had already faded, its wealth and prestige drained by new trade rivals and the arrival of powerful nomadic groups from the north. The Saso Kingdom, under its warlord Samaro Kante, rose in this vacuum, seizing the salt and gold routes, dominating the Mande clans, and crushing opposition with a military machine rooted in fear. Samaro's cruelty was legendary. His control over conquered lands was absolute. Yet within this harsh dominance, resistance began to gather behind the name of a man many thought would never rule. Sundiata Keita, the exiled prince of the Keita clan, would emerge not as a mere rival, but as the architect of a new empire. Sundiata's story is inseparable from the oral traditions of the griots. Yet historical layers within their accounts align with the realities of West African politics in the 1200s. Born around 1210, he was the son of Ner Maghen Konate, a king of Niani and Sagalan, a woman of the Buffalo clan whose lineage carried its own mystical weight. As a child, Sundiata was crippled, unable to walk for years. His weakness made him an unlikely heir, mocked by rivals within his father's court, overshadowed by his half-brothers. When Ner Maghen died, the throne passed not to Sundiata but to Dankaran Tuman, his half-brother, leaving Sundiata and his mother's lineage vulnerable. With Samaro Kante tightening his grip across the region, the Keita family was forced into exile. Exile, however, did not erase Sundiata. It shaped him. Across the courts of allied kings, he gathered not only support but also the political wisdom and military knowledge that exile often provides. He became a leader outside his homeland, a figure whose charisma and reputation drew followers from Mande clans weary of Sasso domination. While Samaro ruled through terror and intimidation, Sundiata slowly built a coalition rooted in loyalty, kinship, and a shared determination to reclaim autonomy. The breaking point came in 1235, when Sundiata returned to confront Samaro at the Battle of Kirina. This was no minor conflict. It was the decisive struggle for supremacy in the Western Sahel. The battle ended with Samaro's flight and the collapse of Sasso power. Sundiata emerged not simply as a victorious warrior but as the unifier of the Mande world. His victory was as much political as it was military. It cemented him as the Munsa, the king of kings, around whom the empire would form. But the legacy of Sundiata lies not only in war. After Kirina, his task was not destruction but creation. He moved swiftly to consolidate the Mande Confederation into a centralized state, laying the administrative and cultural foundations of Mali. Oral histories describe the Kurukan Fuga Assembly, where the clans and leaders gathered to agree upon a charter of governance. This assembly, whether codified in a written sense or preserved through tradition, represented one of the earliest attempts in West Africa to formalize laws, rights, and responsibilities across a diverse empire. The balance of authority, the recognition of clan autonomy, and the obligations of loyalty to the Munsa were all established in this formative moment. The selection of Niani as his capital was equally strategic. Situated near the upper Niger River, Niani stood at the crossroads of vital trade routes, linking the gold fields of Wang Era with the markets of North Africa. By anchoring his rule in Niani, Sundiata placed the empire at the center of commerce, agriculture, and administration. The city grew into more than a royal residence. It became a hub of trade and cultural exchange, reflecting Mali's growing integration into trans-Saharan networks. Merchants carrying salt, cloth, and copper passed through its markets, while caravans laden with gold and kola nuts extended Mali's influence across deserts and savannas. Architecture, too, reflected this consolidation of power. While Mali's later rulers would commission monumental mosques and palaces, Sundiata's reign initiated the practice of transforming the political landscape through construction. Defensive structures, royal compounds, and administrative centers reinforced the authority of Niani, projecting the permanence of the Keita dynasty. It was not a kingdom of tents or temporary war camps. It was an empire meant to endure. Religion also played a critical role. Islam had already made its presence felt in the Sahel, carried by merchants and scholars, but indigenous beliefs remained deeply rooted in Mande society. Sundiata himself embodied this balance, upholding the traditions of his ancestors while recognizing the growing prestige of Islam in political and commercial life. His court reflected this duality, where griots, hunters, and priests coexisted with Muslim advisors and scribes. This synthesis allowed Mali to remain open to broader cultural currents while retaining its Mande identity. The consolidation of power under Sundiata was not without difficulty. Rivalries among clans persisted, and the sheer scale of the empire, stretching from the forests of modern-day Guinea to the Sahelian grasslands, required constant vigilance. Yet his political acumen ensured that the clans remained bound to the empire through kinship ties, mutual obligations, and the promise of shared prosperity through trade. What makes Sundiata's founding epic enduring is that it bridges myth and history, legend and political reality. The griots tell of his rise as destiny, of a crippled child who grew into the Lion King of Mali, a figure marked by supernatural strength and wisdom. Historians recognize within this tale the concrete forces of geography, trade, and political struggle. Both perspectives point to the same truth. Sundiata Keita was the founder not only of a dynasty, but of a political system that would dominate West Africa for centuries. By the time of his death around 1255, Sundiata had transformed the Mande world into an empire that stood at the heart of West Africa. His successors would expand and refine what he created, but it was his consolidation of power, his establishment of Niani as the capital, and his ability to unite a fractured landscape that ensured Mali's survival long after the battles were fought. His reign marked the end of fragmentation and the beginning of Imperial Mali, a state that would command respect from the Niger to the Mediterranean, remembered as one of the greatest civilizations of its age. Gold and salt were more than commodities in West Africa. They were the lifeblood of kingdoms, the pulse that carried power from one horizon to another, and the very foundation upon which the empire of Mali rose into greatness. To understand Mali's might in the 13th and 14th centuries, one must understand the unrelenting grip it held over the arteries of trade that stretched from the forests of the south to the deserts of the north, from the Atlantic coast to the marketplaces of Cairo and beyond. Salt and gold were not mere goods. They were instruments of survival, of luxury, of control, and of political legitimacy. Whoever controlled their movement controlled the destiny of empires. The Sahara, vast and unforgiving, might appear as a barrier to life, but in truth it was a highway, a grueling, dangerous, and costly one, where caravans of camels carried wealth across its endless expanse. Salt, quarried from places like Tagaza and Tadeni in the far north, was as valuable as gold itself. In the burning climate of West Africa, salt was not luxury, it was necessity. It preserved food, sustained health, and allowed armies, traders, and households to endure. Gold, on the other hand, flowed from the river valleys of Bambuk, Gure, and later the Lobi fields. It was this combination, salt carved from the desert and gold panned from the rivers, that forged Mali's economic dominance. The empire stood not merely as a political power but as the pivot of commerce between North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Sundiata Keita laid the foundation, but it was his successors, beginning with his son Wali Keita and extending through the 14th century, who transformed Mali into the economic powerhouse of Africa. By the reign of Mansa Musa, beginning in 1312, the empire commanded a staggering expanse that included key routes linking southern goldfields with northern salt mines and the trans-Saharan trading hubs of Walata, Timbuktu, and Gao. Caravans passing through these arteries were not random flows of commerce. They were regulated, taxed, and protected under Mali's authority. The empire's ability to police these trade routes ensured that wealth funneled into its capital, Niani, and into the hands of its rulers. The mechanics of this dominance rested upon geography and discipline. Mali's southern regions held the gold. The desert fringes held the salt. The empire sat between them like a gatekeeper. Long caravans of camels laden with salt blocks, slabs sometimes weighing over 30 kilograms each, marched southward across desert sands, braving thirst, heat, and raids. On their return journey, the same caravans carried pouches of dust, nuggets, and bars of gold northward toward markets of Morocco, Egypt, and Europe. Taxes were levied at every crossing. Mali's system of tariffs ensured that even goods not produced within its borders still paid tribute to its rulers. This revenue fueled both the stability and the grandeur of the state. By the early 14th century, Mali's wealth had grown to such an extent that European chroniclers began to write of it in astonishment. Gold from Mali entered Mediterranean markets through merchants in North Africa and passed into European coinage, fueling economies far beyond the reach of the Niger River. Indeed, historians estimate that during this period, Mali supplied nearly half of the Old World's gold. It is no coincidence that when cartographers of the Catalan Atlas in 1375 illustrated the world, they drew Mansa Musa as a crowned figure holding a golden orb, a clear acknowledgement of the empire's material supremacy. But Mali's dominance was not built merely on trade itself. It was built on the careful administration of it. The empire established officials who oversaw markets, standardized measures, and controlled the taxation of merchants. In cities like Timbuktu, Jen, and Gao, bustling markets became hubs not only for gold and salt, but also for ivory, kola nuts, cloth, and slaves. Yet gold and salt were the anchors, the high-value goods that ensured Mali's control remained relevant in both local and international trade. Salt carried symbolic weight in Mali's culture. It was so valuable that in some cases, it was used as currency itself, exchanged directly for goods in local markets. Its worth was measured not only in utility but in prestige. To control the salt mines of Tagaza was to control life itself, for every household, from peasant to noble, relied upon its preservation qualities. Gold, conversely, was tied to the image of power. Kings minted their authority in gold, adorned themselves with it, and sent it abroad to demonstrate their legitimacy. The relationship was symbiotic. Salt sustained the people, gold sustained the throne. The legendary pilgrimage of Mansa Musa in 1324 to Mecca illustrates Mali's economic strength in a way no other event does. Setting out with a caravan said to number in the tens of thousands, Musa carried such a vast quantity of gold that his generosity along the route disrupted economies. In Cairo, his gifts and spending caused the value of gold to plummet, an economic ripple that lasted more than a decade. This single episode, described by both Arab chroniclers like Al-Amari and European observers, cemented Mali's reputation as a land of immeasurable wealth. It also demonstrated the delicate balance of gold's abundance. Too much circulation could destabilize markets even thousands of miles away. Mali's rulers understood the weight of this commodity, and so they carefully managed its flow, ensuring that gold dust was restricted to local trade while solid ingots were reserved for international exchange. The control of trade routes also had military dimensions. Mali's kings understood that wealth was fragile without security. Cavalry forces patrolled routes and guarded caravans. Fortified towns were built along key points, ensuring not only safety but also the collection of customs duties. Merchants came to trust Mali's authority. Their reliance on imperial protection bound them into the empire's economic orbit. By channeling the riches of both desert and forest, Mali was able to sustain not only military strength but also cultural and intellectual achievements. The flourishing of Timbuktu as a center of learning, the construction of monumental mosques in Jen, and the expansion of the capital at Niani were all made possible by the wealth generated from gold and salt. These commodities were not merely traded, they were transmuted into stone, learning, and power. The significance of Mali's control over these resources cannot be overstated. It created a system where the empire stood at the intersection of worlds: Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and Europe. It transformed Mali from a regional kingdom into an international power, respected, envied, and feared. It ensured that the name of Mali would be written in the annals of history not simply as a political entity, but as an economic giant whose influence shaped markets far beyond its borders. Salt and gold were the empire's heartbeat, steady and relentless, their movement marking the rhythm of Mali's rise. Every caravan that crossed the Sahara carried with it not only slabs and ingots, but also the affirmation of Mali's supremacy. Every tax collected in its markets reinforced the foundations of its strength. Every foreign coin minted with West African gold bore silent testimony to an empire that commanded the wealth of nations. Mali's dominance was not ephemeral. It was built into the very veins of the Old World's economy, enduring as long as it held fast to the gold fields of the south and the salt mines of the north. In 1324, the world's gaze turned to West Africa, not through conquest or war, but through the sheer force of wealth and spectacle. Mansa Musa, the ruler of Mali, prepared for a pilgrimage to Mecca that would etch his name into history and transform the perception of an African kingdom across continents. He was not the first ruler to make the Hajj, but none before him had undertaken it with such scale, precision, and unrelenting purpose. This was not only a religious obligation, it was a demonstration of power, a declaration of Mali's dominance, and a calculated act of diplomacy that reshaped how Africa was seen in Cairo, in Damascus, and even in the distant courts of Europe. Mali under Musa was already one of the wealthiest empires in the world, nourished by the gold fields of Bambuk, Bure, and Galam, and sustained by the endless caravans of salt, kola nuts, and slaves moving across the Sahara. But Musa understood that true power was not only measured in mines and markets. It was measured in recognition. The Islamic world of the 14th century was a vast network of trade, scholarship, and faith, centered on Mecca, Cairo, and Baghdad. To stand among those powers as an equal, Mali needed to be seen, and Musa resolved that the Hajj would be his instrument. Accounts by Arab chroniclers speak of a procession so vast that it defied imagination. Musa did not travel as a humble pilgrim with a few companions. He moved as a sovereign at the height of authority. Contemporary sources estimate his entourage at 60,000 men, including personal attendants, soldiers, officials, and slaves, all organized into a disciplined march that stretched for miles. Among them were 12,000 slaves, each carrying golden staffs, clothed in brocade and Persian silk, a striking image of wealth displayed without hesitation. The camels, more than 100 in number, carried burdens not of food or supplies, but of gold dust and ingots, so much that the value of the precious metal would be altered in the markets of Cairo for a decade afterward. The route from Mali to Mecca was not a casual trail. It was a trek across the harsh Sahara, through desert oases and trading cities that had long been lifelines of trans-Saharan commerce. Musa's caravan cut through these places like a storm of wealth. Town after town witnessed the passing of a king who gave away gold as though it were nothing more than sand. He distributed alms to the poor, gifts to scholars, and extravagant sums to merchants. For Musa, generosity was both piety and politics. Every coin pressed into an outstretched hand was a statement of Mali's power, its prosperity, and its faith. Cairo in 1324 was the heart of the Mamluk Sultanate, a center of Islamic scholarship and trade. When Musa arrived, the entire city trembled with his presence. Al-Amari, an Arab historian who recorded the testimony of eyewitnesses years later, wrote of the spectacle with fascination and astonishment. Musa's gifts were so abundant that the price of gold in Egypt plummeted, its value dropping by as much as 25%. For years afterward, the devaluation rippled across the Mediterranean economy, a direct consequence of one man's pilgrimage. Cairo's markets had never seen such upheaval caused not by famine or war, but by excess generosity. The Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad received Musa with the full protocol reserved for foreign rulers, yet even he was caught off guard by the Malian king's insistence on independence and dignity. Musa initially resisted bowing to the Sultan, asserting his own sovereign equality, a moment that revealed both his pride and his political astuteness. To bow would have meant submission. To refuse was to declare Mali's position as an empire not subordinate, but parallel to Egypt and its rulers. Eventually, protocol was satisfied without compromise, and Musa's stay in Cairo became one of the most talked about events of the 14th century Islamic world. Yet Musa's pilgrimage was not only a cascade of wealth, it was also a transfer of knowledge, culture, and influence. On his return from Mecca, he brought back architects, scholars, and administrators whose work would transform the intellectual and architectural life of Mali. Among them was Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a renowned Andalusian architect whose designs reshaped the cities of Mali. Under Musa's patronage, the city of Timbuktu rose as a beacon of Islamic scholarship, with the Djinguereber Mosque and Sankore University becoming centers of learning that attracted students from across Africa and beyond. Musa's pilgrimage thus carried not just wealth outward, but also knowledge inward, binding Mali more tightly into the intellectual fabric of the Islamic world. The logistics of such a pilgrimage reveal the extraordinary capacity of Mali's administration. To sustain 60,000 people across thousands of kilometers required organization at every level. Food supplies coordinated from across the Niger Basin, routes secured through alliances with desert tribes, and resources allocated with precision. The sheer act of moving this caravan to Mecca was itself proof of Mali's strength. A reminder that wealth without infrastructure collapses, but Musa had built both. European awareness of Africa was, at this time, limited and often distorted. Yet Mansa Musa's pilgrimage pierced that fog of ignorance. In 1375, decades after his death, the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important world maps of the Middle Ages, depicted Musa seated on a golden throne, holding a nugget of gold in his hand, the embodiment of African wealth and sovereignty. This was not legend, it was testimony. Musa's Hajj had traveled farther than his caravan, inscribing Mali onto the mental maps of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa alike. The pilgrimage of 1324 was therefore more than a religious duty fulfilled. It was an event that shifted economies, altered perceptions, and established Mali's ruler as one of the most powerful monarchs of his age. Musa's wealth was staggering, but his use of it was deliberate. Every coin spent in Cairo, every mosque commissioned on his return, every scholar brought to Timbuktu was a thread in the tapestry of Mali's rising influence. Mansa Musa returned to Mali not diminished by the extravagance of his pilgrimage, but amplified by it. His display of power had not drained Mali, it had advertised it to the world. The reverberations of his Hajj continued long after his caravan disappeared into the Sahel, echoing in the records of Arab chroniclers, the designs of Malian mosques, and the imaginations of European cartographers. He had walked the path to Mecca, but in doing so, he had placed Mali firmly on the stage of global history. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu rose not as a mere stop along the Niger, but as one of the most revered intellectual capitals of the Islamic world. Its name traveled across deserts and seas, whispered in Cairo, written in Andalusian chronicles, and recorded in the works of Arab geographers. Merchants carried goods to its markets, but scholars carried something weightier: ideas, texts, arguments, and the foundations of knowledge that reshaped West Africa's place in the global order. The story of Timbuktu was not of stone walls or towers, but of words, ink, and parchment. An empire of the mind where thought became its strongest currency. By the early 1300s, under the reign of Mansa Musa, the city transformed into a hub where trade and scholarship intertwined. Musa's 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca not only displayed the empire's wealth, but also brought home architects, clerics, and intellectuals who would fuel a scholarly flowering. Timbuktu soon became home to three great centers of learning: the Sankor, Jingareber, and Sidi Yahya mosques. These were not just places of prayer but universities, each with courts filled with students, libraries stacked with manuscripts, and teachers whose names reached distant cities. In their courtyards, Quranic interpretation was debated alongside astronomy, law, philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. The system mirrored the madrasa networks of Cairo and Fez, yet adapted to West African traditions, making Timbuktu a place where African culture and Islamic scholarship met without contradiction. The Jingareber Mosque, designed by the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili and built in 1327, became one of the most iconic. Its sun-dried mud brick walls and wooden beam supports may have appeared modest compared to marble mosques in Cairo, but within those walls the intellectual authority was immense. Students sat cross-legged in circles around their teachers, memorizing Quranic verses, studying the Hadith, and debating fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence that shaped not only spiritual but political life. Manuscripts on logic and rhetoric were copied by hand, their margins filled with notes and commentaries. By the 15th century, Timbuktu could claim thousands of such texts, covering disciplines as varied as medicine and poetry, history, and astronomy. Knowledge became both sacred and practical, meant to guide rulers, merchants, and the faithful alike. The Sankor University was perhaps the crown jewel. Originally a mosque built in the 12th century, it was expanded into a vast intellectual complex during the Mali Empire's height. It could host thousands of students at once, divided into classes that followed the stages of scholarship: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. At the highest level, Scholars debated the works of Al-Ghazali, Ibn Khaldun, and other giants of Islamic thought. Students studied not just Arabic grammar but the philosophical underpinnings of law and governance. The reputation of Angkor grew so vast that manuscripts produced in Timbuktu became prized across North Africa. They were bound in leather, written in precise script, and sold in markets for prices comparable to gold. By the 16th century, during the Songhai Empire under Askia Muhammad I, Timbuktu reached its intellectual peak. The city's libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Families passed collections down through generations, each library a repository of centuries of thought. Scholars such as Ahmad Baba al-Timbukti, born in 1556, became towering figures of West African scholarship. Ahmad Baba's works on jurisprudence and ethics were cited far beyond the Niger Valley, and his personal library of 1,600 volumes was one of the largest in the region. When Moroccan forces invaded in 1591, his exile to Marrakesh became a loss not just for Timbuktu but for the wider Islamic world. Yet even in exile, his writings defended the intellectual heritage of his homeland, keeping Mali's scholarly prestige alive even under occupation. Timbuktu's learning was never limited to theology. Astronomy was studied with precision, using texts imported from the Maghreb and the Middle East. Scholars charted the movement of stars, aligning religious observance with scientific measurement. Medicine drew upon Greek translations, Arab innovations, and local herbal traditions. Legal treatises regulated trade, inheritance, and marriage, creating a structure that balanced Islamic law with local practice. Poetry and literature flourished, with verses written to praise rulers, record events, or reflect on faith. Each discipline was preserved in manuscript form, a fragile but lasting testimony to the city's intellectual breadth. The manuscript trade became a lifeline of Timbuktu's prosperity. Caravans carrying salt, gold, and ivory also carried bundles of books, copied by local scribes with meticulous care. In the markets, manuscripts were traded as eagerly as goods, and their value could surpass that of the most precious metal. This trade linked Timbuktu to Cairo, Tunis, and even Istanbul, embedding West Africa into the global network of Islamic scholarship. It also gave the city a symbolic weight. While gold represented material wealth, manuscripts represented a higher, eternal richness, the wealth of the mind. Yet the survival of these works was fragile. The Moroccan invasion shattered Timbuktu's independence, and many scholars were displaced. Some libraries were looted, manuscripts scattered or destroyed. Despite this, thousands of texts were hidden by families, preserved in chests and buried in sand to escape confiscation. Generations later, these manuscripts resurfaced, revealing the extraordinary scope of learning that had flourished in West Africa long before colonial eyes ever turned toward it. Timbuktu's reputation traveled even during its decline. European maps of the 16th and 17th centuries marked the city with an almost mythical aura. Accounts from North African travelers like Leo Africanus spoke of Timbuktu's wealth, markets, and scholars, making it a name that stirred curiosity across Europe. For outsiders, Timbuktu became shorthand for the farthest reach of civilization, but for those who lived in its walls, it was a place where the act of writing itself was power, where teaching became a form of governance, and knowledge defined status as much as lineage or wealth. The city's survival into modern memory owes much to the resilience of its scholarly families. Manuscripts that had been hidden for centuries were gradually revealed, cataloged, and preserved. Texts on law, astronomy, theology, and medicine now lie in archives, proof that West Africa was not a passive recipient of knowledge but an active producer. Timbuktu was more than a marketplace of goods. It was a marketplace of ideas where West African scholars contributed to global debates on law, science, and philosophy. The story of Timbuktu is not one of myth or exaggeration but of fact, of universities with thousands of students, of libraries with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, of scholars whose works shaped law and thought across continents. Its mud brick mosques still stand, their wooden beams jutting outward, testifying not only to architectural endurance but to centuries of intellectual pursuit. To speak of Timbuktu is to speak of the moment when Mali's wealth was transmuted into something greater than gold. The written word, preserved in ink and parchment, a treasure more enduring than any empire. The empire that had once radiated power under Sundiata Keita and reached dazzling heights under Mansa Musa did not fall in a single stroke, but through years of strain, ambition, betrayal, and the relentless pull of new rivals. By the mid-14th century, the Mali Empire was already showing fractures. Mansa Musa's successors inherited a vast realm stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the interior, but the very scale of this domain became a burden. After Musa's death in 1337, the empire faced the challenge of leadership transitions that lacked his authority and vision. His son Magan I ruled briefly from 1337 to 1341, but his reign was weak, marked by declining influence over distant provinces. Even when his brother Suleiman Keita reigned from 1341 to 1360, keeping the empire intact, the cracks were spreading. The first signs of fragmentation came from within. Local governors and vassal kings, emboldened by distance and their own ambitions, began asserting autonomy. The wealth of Mali, drawn from the goldfields of Bambuk and Bouré, and from the control of trans-Saharan trade, attracted not only external rivals but internal opportunists. Provinces such as Gao, the capital of the Songhai people, had been brought under Mali's control during the empire's peak. Yet the people of Gao never accepted permanent subjugation. In 1335, while Mansa Musa was still alive, the Songhai had already risen once in revolt, only to be suppressed. But these rebellions did not vanish. They festered, waiting for weaker rulers. By the latter half of the 14th century, instability deepened. The empire suffered from dynastic struggles, where each succession to the throne brought uncertainty. Keita princes quarreled, and rival factions within the royal family competed for power. This weakened central authority, allowing border regions to slip further from control. The Tuareg pushed southward into Mali's northern frontiers, disrupting caravan routes, while provinces such as Tekrir and the Wolof states on the Atlantic edge drifted away from imperial influence. The mid-15th century marked a critical turning point with the rise of the Songhai. Centered at Gao, the Songhai were not new adversaries, but by this time they had grown stronger, more organized, and more determined. Mali's grip on Gao had been tenuous since the late 14th century, and by 1430 the Songhai under Sunni Suleiman Dama declared independence. This act was more than rebellion. It was the opening strike in the gradual transfer of supremacy in West Africa from Mali to Songhai. Gao's strategic location on the Niger River allowed it to control vital trade arteries, and once free, the Songhai expanded with ferocity. While external threats rose, internal strife continued to erode Mali's core. Successive Mansas often lacked the charisma and authority of their forebears. Mansa Wali II, ruling around 1468, could not prevent the loss of key territories. Internal revolts became more frequent, and the imperial army, once feared, began to lose cohesion. With the provinces slipping away and the empire's gold wealth no longer flowing as abundantly to the capital at Niamey, Mali's political and military strength waned. The decisive blows came with Songhai's expansion under Sunni Ali, who reigned from 1464 to 1492. Sunni Ali was a formidable warrior king who understood the weaknesses of his enemies and capitalized on them with ruthless efficiency. In 1468, he marched on Timbuktu, once Mali's jewel and the heart of its scholarly reputation. The scholars of Timbuktu, many of whom had flourished under Mali's patronage, now faced a new master. With the capture of Timbuktu, Mali's prestige was fatally wounded. The city that had symbolized intellectual and spiritual power slipped from Keita hands, and with it, the empire's aura dimmed. Yet Sunni Ali was not finished. In 1473, he captured Jen after a long siege, consolidating control over another vital trade and cultural center. These conquests marked the transfer of power in the Western Sudan. Mali, once dominant, now found itself eclipsed by a rival that had learned from its successes and taken advantage of its failures. The loss of these cities was not merely geographic. They represented the collapse of Mali's hold over trans-Saharan commerce, the very lifeline of its wealth. Even as Songhai rose, other forces pressed in. The Mossi to the south repeatedly raided Mali's frontiers, testing its defenses and eroding its stability. To the west, the Wolof Confederation asserted itself, diminishing Mali's control of the Senegal Valley. Meanwhile, the Tuareg raids in the north continued to harass trade routes, weakening Mali's economic core. Each loss chipped away at the empire's cohesion until what had once been a vast centralized power was reduced to a patchwork of contested territories. By the late 15th century, Mali was a shadow of itself. Its rulers retained nominal authority over Niani and the surrounding lands, but the empire that had stretched across thousands of kilometers was gone. Songhai dominated the Niger Bend, controlling the trade in salt, gold, and slaves, while Mali lingered as a fading memory of past grandeur. Even in decline, the Keita lineage clung to fragments of power. The empire endured in reduced form into the 16th century, but it was no longer the center of West African power. The Moroccan invasion of Songhai in 1591, which shattered that empire, indirectly highlighted how completely Mali had fallen from its former position. By then, Mali's influence was confined to small territories, its golden cities long lost, its reputation as a global power a distant echo. What had undone Mali was not only the might of external rivals like Songhai, but also the slow corrosion of internal divisions, the inability of successive rulers to maintain the unity and vision that had defined the empire's peak. The Mali Empire's fragmentation and decline were not sudden tragedies, but the drawn-out unraveling of greatness. Provinces slipped away, vassals declared independence, rivals seized trade cities, and one by one the pillars of power crumbled. The gold that once dazzled the Mediterranean world no longer flowed through its veins. The scholars who once thrived under its protection gave their allegiance to new rulers. And the armies that had once carried the Keita name across West Africa found themselves unable to hold even the core of the empire together. Mali's downfall was the story of how wealth and power, unmatched for a century, proved insufficient against time, ambition, and human weakness. It was the story of a state that had once commanded the attention of kings, popes, and merchants across the known world, now reduced by the rise of Songhai and the weight of its own fractures. The fall of Mali did not erase its memory, but it marked the end of an age, leaving behind echoes of greatness in the chronicles of Ibn Khaldun and the ruins of once glorious cities along the Niger. The empire's light, which had once burned brighter than any in West Africa, dimmed under the relentless pressure of internal strife and external conquest, until all that remained was the memory of power slipping inexorably into the hands of its rivals. The Mali Empire is gone from the maps, but it has never left the tongues of its people. Its ruins may rest in silence, its palaces long surrendered to dust, yet its heartbeat survives in voices carried across centuries. Those voices belong to the griots, the custodians of memory, men and women who keep history alive not in stone but in sound. They trace their lineage back to the earliest days of Mali, claiming authority not from written manuscripts but from unbroken chains of recitation, a living archive that has endured when kingdoms collapsed and libraries burned. The griot is not merely a storyteller but a repository of knowledge, a walking chronicle who preserves family lineages, dynastic struggles, victories, betrayals, and moral lessons, all bound together in rhythm and voice. When the empire was at its height in the 13th and 14th centuries, griots stood in the courts of rulers, advising kings with knowledge that spanned generations. Sundiata Keita, the founder of Mali in the early 13th century, did not carry his story in inscriptions carved into stone or parchment sealed in royal archives. His epic lived in the griot's chants, carried across time by oral tradition. To this day, the epic of Sundiata is recited in parts of West Africa, its details shaped by centuries of repetition, yet rooted in a core truth, that Mali's greatness was not only in its wealth and armies but in its ability to endure in memory. Oral tradition in West Africa is not casual storytelling. It is an institution as binding as law and as vital as scripture. Families rely on griots to preserve genealogies stretching back generations, ensuring that bloodlines are never forgotten. Villages rely on them to carry the wisdom of ancestors, binding communities through shared pasts. In the context of Mali, oral tradition filled the spaces that fragile manuscripts could not protect. Where libraries in Timbuktu were looted or neglected over the centuries, where the climate eroded ink and parchment, griots carried knowledge in a form no army could burn. The griot songs are not mere memory. They are performance, layered with music, rhythm, and metaphor. Accompanied by instruments such as the kora, a 21-stringed harp lute that became the griot's signature. History was sung as much as it was spoken. The kora's resonance gave history its permanence, imprinting it not only on the mind but on the heart. In this way, the legacy of Mali was not confined to lecture halls or archives but became woven into everyday life. Celebrated at weddings, invoked at funerals, repeated in marketplaces, and retold during conflicts as reminders of past triumphs and tragedies. This oral preservation was crucial after the empire's decline in the late 15th and 16th centuries. When Songhai forces rose and eclipsed Mali's political power, the memory of Mali did not vanish with its armies. Instead, griots ensured that Mali lived on as a cultural giant even when it ceased to be a political one. They remembered the wealth of Mansa Musa, whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 astonished the Islamic world with gold so abundant it disrupted economies. They remembered the learning of Timbuktu, where scholars debated Islamic law and astronomy in the madrasas. They remembered the battles fought at Karina, the alliances forged, the betrayals endured. This memory outlived the empire itself. The griot's authority lies in continuity. Families pass down the role from generation to generation, training apprentices from childhood to master not only the words but the cadence, the symbolic depth, the subtle variations that make oral history both faithful and alive. A griot cannot recite history like a lifeless list. The griot breathes into it emotion, bringing the past into the present so powerfully that listeners feel the weight of ancient decisions on their own lives. Through this continuity, Mali became more than a chapter in forgotten chronicles. It became a living presence in African identity. The epic of Sundiata exemplifies this power. It tells of Sundiata Keita's birth, his childhood struggles, his eventual rise, and the founding of the empire. Though composed in oral form long after his reign, it has remained central to Mande identity, celebrated across Mali, Guinea, Senegal, and beyond. Its themes, perseverance, unity, the triumph of destiny, resonate beyond centuries, shaping a shared cultural pride. The epic's preservation demonstrates how oral tradition can anchor history when material artifacts falter. Mali's identity also survives in the broader sense of African self-definition. During the colonial period, when European powers dismissed African history as marginal or non-existent, griots stood as living rebuttals. They carried proof of civilizations that rivaled the greatest of Europe and Asia. They sang of empires that built wealth through trade stretching from the Niger River to the Mediterranean, of scholars who debated philosophy centuries before colonialism arrived, of rulers who commanded armies and maintained order across vast landscapes. These oral traditions resisted the erasure imposed by outsiders, keeping pride alive even in the face of foreign domination. The endurance of Mali in memory also lies in its symbols. Timbuktu, though often romanticized in European imagination as a mythical city at the edge of the world, is remembered within African identity as a center of knowledge. The Sankore Mosque, founded in the 14th century, became a cornerstone of West African learning. Manuscripts stored in Timbuktu's libraries, though fragile and scattered, still testify to centuries of scholarship, while griots ensured that even when manuscripts were lost, the knowledge they represented did not vanish. In Mali's memory, learning was not just for the elite, but a shared heritage that spoke of Africa's intellectual traditions. The griot's work continues into the present. In villages across Mali and beyond, griots still recite lineages and epics, their voices carrying the echoes of centuries past. In urban centers, griot traditions have adapted, merging with modern art forms, yet their core function, preserving memory, remains unchanged. Their survival testifies to the resilience of oral culture in a world dominated by written records and digital archives. Mali's memory also lives through language itself. The Mande languages, carrying proverbs, idioms, and oral wisdom, transmit more than communication. They transmit worldview. Each proverb echoes centuries of accumulated experience, embedding Mali's legacy in the very act of speaking. To this day, The idea of Mali as a great empire is not a matter of archaeological debate for its descendants. It is a living inheritance, continuously reinforced through word and song. In this way, Mali has never truly vanished. Its walls may crumble, its palaces fade, but the griot's voices ensure that Mali exists wherever the words are spoken, wherever a chorus strings are plucked, wherever a child hears the epic of Sundiata for the first time. Oral tradition has carried Mali across the centuries, shaping identity, defying oblivion, and ensuring that the empire's grandeur is not confined to history books but remains part of the living pulse of Africa. Long before the arrival of foreign traders and colonial intrusions, a kingdom rose in the heart of southern Africa, built not on fragile wood or clay but on stone that endures to this day. The Shona people, descendants of Bantu-speaking groups who had gradually migrated into the region between the 5th and 9th centuries, forged a civilization whose identity would be carved into granite. By the 11th century, their settlements expanded across the fertile plateau between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers, an area rich in pastures, game, and arable land. This was the land where Great Zimbabwe would rise, and with it, one of Africa's most striking testaments to human organization, wealth, and culture. The Shona were not nomads chasing fleeting resources. They were agriculturalists and herders, settled and rooted. They cultivated sorghum and millet, staples that sustained their growing communities, while cattle became both a source of food and a measure of wealth. In Shona society, cattle were more than property. They symbolized prestige, social standing, and even spiritual favor. To possess many cattle was to command respect, for herds could be traded, sacrificed, or gifted in marriage. The expansion of herds and farms, however, required coordination, stability, and hierarchy, and from this need, leadership structures grew. Chiefs rose from kinship networks, their authority strengthened by control over land and trade routes, until, by the late 11th century, centralized authority began consolidating in ways that would reshape the region. It was around this period, between 1100 and 1200, that stone architecture first appeared. The Shona masons cut granite blocks directly from exposed outcrops, shaping them without mortar, fitting stone upon stone in walls that could stand for centuries. This architectural shift reflected more than just a change in building technique. It signaled political ambition. Permanent stone walls symbolized permanence of rule. They enclosed sacred spaces, marked divisions between rulers and subjects, and elevated the authority of those who dwelt within them. Villages that had once been dispersed homesteads of mud and would begin clustering around central stone compounds, where power radiated outward. The rise of Great Zimbabwe cannot be understood without its connection to trade. The Shona were positioned strategically between Africa's interior and the Indian Ocean coast. By the 11th century, gold extracted from riverbeds and mines within their territory became their greatest asset. Gold was panned in the streams and mined from deposits in the interior, then carried on caravan routes to the Swahili city-states on the Indian Ocean, such as Kilwa and Sofala. From there it traveled farther still, reaching Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Alongside gold, ivory was another valuable commodity, harvested from elephants that roamed the savannas. Shona merchants exchanged these goods for glass beads, porcelain, cloth, and other luxury items from across the seas. Every shard of Chinese celadon and every glass bead unearthed within Great Zimbabwe's ruins testifies to this global exchange. As wealth from trade and cattle accumulated, power centralized further. By the 13th century, a ruler, often referred to by historians as the Mambo or king, exercised authority not just over his immediate settlement but over vast territories that acknowledged his dominance. Villages sent tribute in cattle, grain, and labor, reinforcing his supremacy. Religious authority bolstered political power, for the king was also seen as the intermediary with ancestors and spiritual forces, responsible for the fertility of the land and the well-being of his people. His position was not merely secular. It carried profound spiritual weight, binding the community together under a shared worldview. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the stone city at the heart of this polity expanded into what we now call Great Zimbabwe. The settlement sprawled across 7 square kilometers, its monumental architecture divided into distinct zones. The hill complex, perched atop a rocky outcrop, served as the spiritual and political core. Its terraces, enclosures, and ritual spaces projected dominance over the surrounding plain. Below, the great enclosure rose, a vast elliptical wall, some 250 meters in circumference and up to 11 meters high, enclosing smaller structures within. The craftsmanship required to shape and stack thousands of granite blocks without mortar was immense, a skill passed through generations of masons who could make stone hold against gravity and time. Near it stood the Valley Complex, a cluster of smaller enclosures and dwellings where the nobility and retainers lived. The architecture reflected not only engineering mastery but a social hierarchy expressed through space. To live within stone walls was to live closer to power. Great Zimbabwe at its height between the 13th and 15th centuries may have been home to 15,000 to 20,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa at the time. Its scale rivals many medieval European towns, a testament to the organizational capacities of the Shona elite. Archaeological evidence shows specialized craft production flourished, iron smelting, pottery, beadmaking, all sustaining a thriving economy tied to both regional subsistence and international trade. Gold weighed and prepared for exchange passed through the hands of merchants. Ivory tusks were carried along caravan paths, and goods imported from distant oceanside markets filtered into the lives of elites. The identity of Great Zimbabwe was inseparable from its stone. The Shona word Zimbabwe itself means house of stone, and these structures were not mere fortifications but symbols of authority and sacredness. The Great Walls defined boundaries between ruler and ruled, the sacred and the profane, the eternal and the everyday. They spoke of permanence, of the weight of lineage and ancestors, of a society rooted in both the material and the spiritual. Even the soapstone bird carvings found atop monoliths in the site carry symbolic weight. These stylized avian figures, some merging human and bird features, are thought to represent spiritual messengers, linking the king and the ancestors, bridging the earthly and the divine. Today, the bird remains a symbol of national identity in Zimbabwe itself, drawn directly from the artistry of this ancient kingdom. Yet the rise of Great Zimbabwe was not inevitable. It was the product of environment, resource control, trade, and cultural organization working in balance. Its location was no accident. The plateau offered rich pastures for cattle, fertile soils for farming, and access to gold fields. The surrounding granite hills provided the very stone used for construction. The trade routes passing through its territory connected it to the Swahili coast, making it a hub in a global network stretching from Africa to Asia. Each element reinforced the other. Agriculture fed the population, cattle structured society, trade enriched the elite, religion legitimized power, and stone enshrined authority. From the outside, it seemed as though this kingdom of stone was destined to last, its walls unyielding, its trade routes thriving, its rulers secure. But history is never static. Shifting trade patterns, ecological pressures, and political changes elsewhere would eventually challenge the supremacy of Great Zimbabwe. For now, in its rise and flourishing, it stood as the central force of Shona civilization, a monumental presence in southern Africa. Its legacy was written not only in oral traditions, but in granite walls that still stand against centuries of time, silent yet unbroken witnesses to the rise of a kingdom that once commanded both land and imagination. The walls rise in silence, yet they speak of power. At the heart of Great Zimbabwe stands the Great Enclosure, a structure so monumental that even today, it resists easy explanation. Built entirely without mortar, its walls soar as high as 11 meters, stretching for over 250 meters in length, curving and bending in ways that defy the simplicity of stone. Each granite block was cut, shaped, and set in place by hand, fitted with such precision that they hold together centuries later without the need for binding cement. It is the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara, and it remains a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of the Shona builders who raised it between the 13th and 15th centuries. To walk through the Great Enclosure is to confront an architectural paradox. It is both fortress and sanctuary, both symbol and space. Archaeologists studying the arrangement of its walls have long debated their function. The sheer size suggests a role tied to prestige rather than utility. Its inward-turning corridors and narrow passageways, twisting deliberately, suggest control of movement, an architecture of ceremony rather than of war. The stonework is too elegant, too intentional, to be dismissed as mere defense. The walls do not guard against enemies. They enclose power. The enclosure was not a random creation of loose stone stacking. Each wall followed a method, a rhythm. Builders split massive granite boulders by heating them with fire, then cooling them rapidly with water, producing clean fractures. From these breaks came blocks of remarkable uniformity. Workers shaped them into courses that were laid in interlocking patterns, each stone supporting the weight of the next. The outer walls are curved, not rigidly straight, an intentional design that adds both strength and fluidity. The lack of mortar was not a weakness but a technique. It allowed the structure to withstand time, weather, and even earthquakes, as the stones could shift minutely without collapsing. At its heart stands the conical tower, a massive solid cylinder of stone over 9 meters tall. It has no entrance, no hollow interior, no apparent function in the practical sense. Yet its presence commands attention. Many historians interpret it as a symbol of authority, a physical manifestation of abundance and strength. Among the Shona, grain was wealth, and the tower's shape recalls a granary, magnified to monumental scale. To build a tower that could not be filled may have been a declaration that the ruler's power itself was inexhaustible, that his authority did not depend on the harvest but transcended it. The symbolic weight of the great enclosure extends beyond the tower. The walls themselves separate spaces into layers of significance. Some passages lead only to confined courtyards, places where the few could gather unseen from outside. The complexity of its interior suggests it was meant to restrict access, to create stages of entry into the ruler's presence. Ordinary people would never have walked freely through these walls. Their role was to witness from outside the vastness of what had been built, to feel the shadow of its stones and understand the order they represented. The great enclosure is not isolated from the rest of the city. It stands in relation to the hill complex nearby, where political and religious authority was also centered. While the hill offered height and natural defense, the great enclosure projected visibility on the open plain. Its monumental form could be seen from a distance, declaring permanence. The relationship between these two centers suggests a deliberate duality. The hill as the seat of ancestral and spiritual legitimacy, and the enclosure as the visible stage of worldly power. Together, they embodied a society where rulership was both sacred and political, where stone was not just material but a medium of authority. European archaeologists who first examined the site in the late 19th century refused to believe that Africans could have built such structures. They attributed it to Phoenicians, Arabs, or even mythical civilizations, blinded by the prejudices of their time. It was only in the 20th century, after decades of resistance, that the truth gained recognition. The Shona ancestors of today's Zimbabwean people were the architects of this marvel. That denial itself adds to the symbolic weight of the great enclosure. It is not only a monument of the past but also of contested memory. The refusal to credit its builders speaks to how powerful its presence remains, challenging narratives that sought to erase African achievement. The sheer labor behind the construction is staggering. Estimates suggest that over 1 million granite blocks were used in the great enclosure. Each was carried, shaped, and set without the wheel, without metal cranes, without draft animals. The human effort alone carved a permanent mark into the landscape. Such a task required organization at the highest level. Specialized laborers, stonemasons, overseers, and planners who could envision not just walls, but a living symbol of unity and dominance. The society that built the structure was not fragmented but centralized, able to mobilize vast resources in the name of a single vision. Archaeological evidence shows that the enclosure was at the heart of ritual and ceremony. Pottery shards, beads from as far as India, and porcelain from China have been unearthed within its walls, suggesting that it was not only a local center but part of the global trade networks that reached the Indian Ocean. That such artifacts were found inside the enclosure rather than outside reveals the exclusivity of those who entered. To stand within these walls was to be in a space tied not only to local kingship but to the wealth of the wider world. A place where the authority of rulers was reinforced by objects brought from distant coasts and continents. Even the patterns in the stonework carry meaning. In certain stretches, the walls show chevron and herringbone designs, subtle yet deliberate. These were not structural necessities but aesthetic choices, a way of embedding art into architecture. The stones speak not only of labor but of creativity, of a culture where beauty and power were inseparable. The wall's sheer thickness, often more than 4 meters at the base, made them both immovable and eternal. They were not walls meant to be scaled or breached. They were walls meant to endure, to proclaim. The enclosure has long stood as a reminder that architecture is not only about shelter or defense. It is about meaning carved into stone, about societies expressing their order and their identity in forms that last beyond generations. For the Shona, the great enclosure was a declaration of permanence, of a kingdom confident enough to inscribe its presence on the earth itself. Each block is a fragment of that confidence, and together they form a structure that even centuries of abandonment, looting, and weather could not erase. The great enclosure continues to command awe not only because of its scale but because of what it represents. The power of human organization, the artistry of stone without mortar, and the vision of a society that raised walls not just to enclose space but to embody its own meaning. To walk its curves is to read the ambitions of its builders in granite, ambitions that have outlived both kings and kingdoms. It stands still, silent yet unbroken. Its stone language is clear today as it was 600 years ago. Gold from the heart of southern Africa did not remain locked in the granite hills of the interior. It moved, carried on the backs of men, through narrow paths cut into the land, flowing from the veins of the earth to the ports of the Indian Ocean. At the center of this network stood Great Zimbabwe, its prosperity tied to the relentless rhythm of the gold trade. The mines that dotted the hinterlands, particularly around the regions of Mashonaland and Matabeleland, yielded dust and nuggets that were sifted, weighed, and transported toward the east. This wealth passed through the hands of traders and chiefs, binding the Shona people to a world far larger than their stone walls suggested. By the 10th century, Arab and Persian merchants sailing the monsoon winds had already established trading towns along the Swahili coast, stretching from Mogadishu in the north to Kilwa and Sofala in the south. These towns were not mere fishing villages. They were cosmopolitan centers where African, Arab, Indian, and later, even Chinese influences blended into something distinct. Kilwa, situated on a small island off present-day Tanzania, became one of the most important nodes in this network. By controlling Sofala, the port closest to the goldfields of Zimbabwe, Kilwa grew into one of the wealthiest cities of the medieval world. The link between Great Zimbabwe and Sofala was both practical and symbolic. From the stone citadels of the Shona elites, caravans of ivory, hides, and above all gold made their way southeast. Sofala, located in present-day Mozambique, became the funnel through which this wealth poured into the oceanic trade system. Arab merchants recorded its significance as early as the 11th century, noting the abundance of gold that passed through. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler who reached the Swahili coast in the 14th century, described Kilwa as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities he had ever seen. Its wealth derived directly from its access to the gold routes inland. Kilwa's prosperity was not accidental. Its sultans deliberately extended their reach to dominate Sofala, ensuring that no rival could intercept the flow of gold from the Zimbabwean plateau. The Kilwa Chronicle, a Swahili Arabic history compiled centuries later, records how Sultan Al-Hassan ibn Sulayman purchased Kilwa and expanded its power. With Sofala under Kilwa's influence, Great Zimbabwe's exports fed directly into the Indian Ocean trade system that stretched as far as Aden, Gujarat, and even the ports of China. The mechanics of this trade were precise. Shona traders carried raw gold to Sofala, where it was weighed against imported goods. Arab and Persian merchants exchanged textiles, beads, ceramics, and metalware, items that would later be found in the archaeological record of Great Zimbabwe itself. Chinese porcelain shards unearthed in the ruins testify to the astonishing range of these connections, proof that gold mined in southern Africa reached the courts of the Yuan and Ming dynasties. The Shona elite, who controlled access to the gold, accumulated wealth and prestige, consolidating their authority through the circulation of foreign luxuries. The Swahili coast was not an isolated extension of Africa, but a maritime frontier where cultures converged. Stone mosques, coral houses, and Arabic inscriptions reveal the Islamic identity that shaped Kilwa and its peers. Yet this identity was fused with African traditions. The Kiswahili language itself, Bantu in structure but laden with Arabic vocabulary, is the clearest testament to this synthesis. It was in this multilingual, multicultural environment that Zimbabwean gold was transformed into a currency of power that linked the southern interior to the wider Indian Ocean basin. Control of the gold trade defined the rise of Great Zimbabwe in the 13th and 14th centuries. Archaeological surveys indicate that the city reached its peak between 1300 and 1450, its monumental stone enclosures coinciding with the height of its participation in the international market. Gold mined from riverbeds and reefs in the Zimbabwean plateau provided the foundation for this prosperity. Without mortar, its walls rose higher. Without interruption, its gold flowed outward. Kilwa's dominance of the trade ensured that gold from Zimbabwe became the lifeblood of its economy. Al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century, referred to the land of gold in the south, while later records from the Portuguese after 1500 confirmed the same wealth. By then, the Portuguese were seeking to insert themselves into the same network that had carried Zimbabwean gold across the Indian Ocean for centuries. When Vasco da Gama reached the Swahili coast in 1498, his men were astonished at the richness of the cities, particularly Kilwa and Sofala, whose prosperity traced back to their inland connections. The significance of this trade extended far beyond wealth. Gold was more than a commodity. It was a symbol of political legitimacy. The ruling elite of Great Zimbabwe derived their authority from their control of its movement. Access to the coast was not open to all. It was regulated, monopolized by those who ruled from the stone citadel. This centralization of trade power allowed them to build alliances, reward loyalty, and maintain the social order that sustained the city. At the same time, the Swahili city-states were tied to the fortunes of Great Zimbabwe. When the balance shifted inland, it reverberated across the coast. The decline of Great Zimbabwe after the mid-15th century coincided with the weakening of Kilwa's supremacy. As the political center in the interior fragmented and new polities like the Matapa state rose to prominence, the axis of the gold trade shifted, drawing new patterns across the map of southern Africa. Yet for centuries before that decline, the link between Great Zimbabwe, Sofala, and Kilwa represented one of the most remarkable economic systems of the medieval world. Southern African gold, carried along caravan routes, passed through Swahili ports, and entered global networks that spanned thousands of miles. Its traces remain in the porcelain shards of Zimbabwe, in the coral stone mosques of Kilwa, in the Arabic manuscripts that praised Sofala, and in the written records of travelers who marveled at the wealth that seemed inexhaustible. The Indian Ocean trade was not abstract. It was a system of wind, stone, and human ambition. Monsoon winds carried the dhows from Arabia and India, while stone walls in Zimbabwe stood as silent witnesses to the wealth these exchanges produced. The ambitions of rulers inland matched the ambitions of sultans on the coast, both sustained by the ceaseless flow of gold. The story of Great Zimbabwe and the Swahili coast is not a peripheral footnote to world history. It is one of its central arteries, a pulse that connected Africa's interior to the farthest reaches of Asia long before Europeans arrived on the horizon. By the mid-15th century, the walls of Great Zimbabwe stood as silent witnesses to a transformation that no single enemy had caused. The decline that swept across this once thriving center of power was neither sudden nor violent. It was a slow unraveling, the cumulative weight of environmental strain, shifting trade patterns, and the very limits of human ambition pressing against the fragile balance that had sustained life in this stone-built city. The end was written not in conquest but in exhaustion, and the silence that followed was as striking as the grandeur that had once filled its enclosures. The foundations of collapse were laid in the soil itself. Great Zimbabwe had grown powerful by harnessing its surrounding landscape, pulling wealth from fertile valleys, stone from nearby quarries, and wood from the forests that clothed the hills. Yet by the late 1400s, this extraction carried a cost. Agriculture, once the lifeblood of the city, began to strain under relentless demand. Maize had not yet reached southern Africa. Instead, millet and sorghum remained the staples. These grains thrived in rotation, but the demand of a swelling population left fields overworked. Without time to regenerate, yields declined, and each successive harvest brought less security. Where once granaries had stood full, families began to rely on less reliable food sources. Their survival threatened not by sudden famine, but by creeping scarcity that gnawed at confidence in the city's strength. Cattle, the ultimate marker of wealth and prestige in Shona society, also contributed to this burden. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe, whose legitimacy was tied to the size of their herds, encouraged the expansion of grazing lands. But cattle require space, and the surrounding environment could sustain only so much. Overgrazing stripped the land of vegetation, compacting the soil and accelerating erosion. Water supplies, already precious, grew harder to maintain. Streams that once offered steady flows became less reliable, shrinking in the dry season, a warning that the balance between humans, animals, and the land had shifted dangerously. Even the forests paid the price. The monumental stone walls of the Great Enclosure and the hill complex had not been built with mortar, but their construction demanded vast amounts of timber to transport, support, and shape the granite blocks. Later, constant demand for firewood, both for daily life and for smelting gold and iron, stripped the hillsides bare. As trees disappeared, so too did shade, soil retention, and ecological stability. What had once been a carefully managed environment turned into one that could no longer give enough to sustain its inhabitants at the scale to which they had grown accustomed. The exhaustion of the land coincided with a transformation beyond Zimbabwe's walls. For centuries, Great Zimbabwe had drawn its strength from the gold trade. The veins and river deposits of the Zimbabwean plateau had supplied bullion that moved across caravan routes to the Swahili coast. At ports like Sofala, this gold passed into the hands of Arab merchants and, eventually, into the wider Indian Ocean world, fueling commerce that stretched to India, Persia, and even China. In return came cloth, glass beads, ceramics, and luxuries that marked the prestige of the ruling elite. Yet, in the 15th century, these trade routes shifted. The Portuguese arrival in East Africa around the 1490s did not initiate Great Zimbabwe's decline, but it accelerated existing fractures. Earlier, coastal centers such as Kilwa Kisawani had dominated commerce, drawing inland caravans to Sofala, the critical link for gold moving out of Zimbabwe. But as rival centers emerged and external pressures mounted, the balance tilted away. Control over gold routes slipped, and competing powers further south and north offered alternatives to traders. The caravans that had once poured wealth into Great Zimbabwe began to bypass it, weakening the very foundation of its economy. The elite, once bound together by their monopoly over gold and cattle, now faced growing difficulty in maintaining their authority. The prestige of the stone enclosures, so carefully constructed as symbols of power, could not mask the erosion of resources and influence. When wealth diminished, so too did the ability to command loyalty. Internal fractures likely widened, with rival leaders seeking to carve out their own spheres of influence in regions where resources remained more plentiful. The city that had once drawn people in now began to lose them. Populations migrated toward more fertile lands or toward emerging centers that inherited Zimbabwe's mantle, such as Kami to the west and later Matapa to the north. Archaeological evidence reinforces this slow decline. By the 16th century, occupation of the hill complex and Great Enclosure had thinned. Pottery styles changed, reflecting shifting populations. Imported goods, once abundant, grew scarce, signaling the weakening of external ties. Even the stone walls, though unbroken, bore the silence of neglect. Where once fires burned and voices echoed, vegetation crept inward, filling courtyards that had once symbolized the height of power. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe did not come from a dramatic fall, but from an irreversible drift. The land that had sustained it was tired, the routes that had enriched it had changed, and the authority that had bound its people had weakened. By the time Portuguese traders were recording their first impressions of Sofala in the early 1500s, the great city inland was already fading, remembered more in rumor than in presence. What remained were the walls themselves, impossible to ignore, resistant to time, defiant in their silence. The great enclosure, with its towering granite courses laid without mortar, stood as testimony to ambition even as life drained from the city it once anchored. Its sheer scale, unmatched anywhere else in sub-Saharan Africa, continued to speak of a society that had commanded immense wealth, organization, and vision. But the people who had raised it were dispersing, their ambitions redirected, their energy no longer tied to this place. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe in the 15th century was not merely the end of a city. It was the reshaping of a landscape of power. It marked the passing of a system built on fragile ecological balances and precarious trade monopolies. It left behind stone that could endure long after memory faded. When silence finally settled over the ruins, it was not the silence of sudden destruction but of gradual surrender, a testament to the unrelenting forces of environment, economy, and human limitation pressing against even the grandest of human achievements. When Europeans first set their eyes on the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th century, they were confronted with stone walls unlike anything they expected to find in the heart of southern Africa. Towering dry stone constructions, some reaching heights of over 10 meters, stretched across the landscape in ordered enclosures, terraces, and passageways that spoke of an organized state with vision and power. Yet, rather than acknowledge what stood plainly before them, that Africans had built a monumental urban center commanding trade and authority, they reached instead for explanations that stripped the ruins of their rightful authors. To the colonizers, the site was too sophisticated to have been constructed by Africans, too monumental to fit their preconceived notions of what Africa represented. And so a long cycle of myth-making and denial began, with Great Zimbabwe at the center of a colonial narrative designed not to explain history, but to erase it. By 1871, when German explorer Karl Mach visited the site, his mind was already prepared to interpret the ruins through the lens of biblical fantasy. He declared the walls to be evidence of Solomon's legendary mines, attributing their construction to outsiders, likely Phoenicians or Arabs, who, in his imagination, had ventured inland from the Indian Ocean in search of gold. Mach claimed that he found traces of cedar beams in the architecture and insisted they must have been imported from Lebanon, for he could not accept that the native builders had achieved such engineering with local resources. These were not casual misinterpretations. They were deliberate projections shaped by a European worldview that placed African achievement outside the realm of possibility. To admit African authorship would mean admitting that the continent had once hosted advanced political states, sophisticated trade networks, and an urban culture that had flourished long before European colonization. As the British South Africa Company extended its control into the territory in the 1890s, myths around Great Zimbabwe became more deeply institutionalized. Cecil Rhodes and his associates, hungry to justify conquest, seized upon the idea that the ruins had been created by non-Africans. By denying African authorship, colonizers constructed a narrative that painted the land as one waiting to be reclaimed by its true inheritors, the supposed descendants of Semitic or Mediterranean builders. This rewriting of the past had political weight. It allowed imperialists to argue that Africans were merely squatters in a land with a grand heritage they had not built, a heritage Europeans now claimed the right to revive. In 1905, British archaeologist David Randall MacIver produced evidence that the ruins were of African origin, dating them no earlier than the 12th century and linking them to the Shona-speaking people. His findings were based on meticulous excavation that unearthed artifacts of African craftsmanship, pottery, and trade goods consistent with a local civilization tied to Indian Ocean commerce. Yet his conclusions were dismissed or suppressed because they collided with the colonial narrative. For the settlers who now called Rhodesia their home, to accept that Great Zimbabwe was African would dismantle the racial logic upon which their occupation rested. The colonial state instead embraced Gertrude Cotton Thompson's 1929 excavation when it appeared to confirm what they desired. Cotton Thompson, though more rigorous than Mach, concluded that the ruins were indeed of African construction, based on her discovery of evidence that matched Shona culture. Yet even her authoritative declaration was selectively interpreted. Her work was acknowledged when it suited imperial propaganda, but the broader public narrative continued to present Great Zimbabwe as a site with mysterious, foreign origins. School textbooks in Rhodesia long perpetuated myths that Phoenicians, Arabs, or Hebrews had built the complex, erasing Shona identity from the story of their own ancestors' achievements. It was not only denial but also destruction that followed. Colonial looting stripped Great Zimbabwe of artifacts, with gold, beads, and ceramics carted off to museums in Europe. The ruins became an object of fascination, but always framed through a lens of European authorship. Even the naming of the land, Southern Rhodesia, was an act of effacement, overwriting the connection between the site and the people who still lived nearby, people whose oral traditions remembered the builders not as strangers from distant continents, but as their own kin. The tide began to shift in the mid-20th century, as African scholars and archaeologists reclaimed the narrative through rigorous research and documentation. Excavations by Peter Garlake in the 1960s challenged the colonial myths with undeniable clarity, presenting material evidence that confirmed Great Zimbabwe's Shona origins. Garlake's scholarship was met with hostility from the white minority government of Rhodesia, which attempted to silence him and suppress his publications. To the regime, acknowledging African authorship was dangerous. It contradicted the racial hierarchy upon which their political order rested. But the evidence only grew stronger. Radiocarbon dating in the mid-20th century established construction phases between the 11th and 15th centuries, aligning perfectly with the rise and decline of the Zimbabwe kingdom. Imported trade goods, Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, Indian beads were found in the ruins, affirming its role within the Indian Ocean trade network. These were not the remnants of outsiders building colonies inland. They were signs of a state connected to global commerce, controlling gold production and asserting power over regional trade routes. By the time Zimbabwe won independence in 1980, the ruins had transformed from a silenced past into a powerful national symbol. The new nation took its very name from Great Zimbabwe, restoring the link between land, people, and history that colonialism had tried to sever. What had been denied for decades now stood as a declaration of African achievement, a reminder that long before European colonization, Africa had built kingdoms with architecture and trade systems of astonishing scale. The site itself remains an unyielding testament, its granite walls rising without mortar, its curved passages and massive enclosures whispering of political authority and ceremonial life. The great enclosure, with its imposing walls and the enigmatic conical tower, reflects not only engineering mastery, but also a cultural identity rooted in Shona traditions. Archaeology has shown that these structures were not palaces for foreign kings, but centers of power for African rulers who commanded vast territories stretching from the Zambezi to the Limpopo. Even today, the myths linger in subtle forms, remnants of centuries of denial. Yet modern archaeology continues to dismantle them with precision, grounding the narrative firmly in the African context. Great Zimbabwe is no longer treated as an anomaly or mystery. It is understood as the capital of a kingdom that rose through control of gold, cattle, and trade, flourishing between the 11th and 15th centuries. It stands as one of Africa's greatest architectural achievements, recognized by UNESCO in 1986 as a World Heritage Site not because of exotic myths, but because of its true history. Great Zimbabwe's rediscovery is not just archaeological. It is political, cultural, and emotional. It is a confrontation with the lies that colonialism told, a restoration of African agency, and a symbol of pride for millions who see in its walls the proof of their ancestors' greatness. The myths that once denied African authorship have collapsed under the weight of evidence, but the scars of erasure remain as reminders of how power shapes history. The stone walls endure, unbroken by time, speaking more truth than any colonial narrative ever could, carrying the voice of a civilization that Europe tried to silence but could never erase.